أثاره انفجار ثاني وانفجارات كبيرة وهائلة، وربما هذا ما أشار له المسؤولون العسكريون.
The United States is in a state of security and no crime.
We fear this. We fear that they have something out that majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı, ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone fixed me on it. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Annyeonghaseyo. Hello, welcome to Varn blog, and today we're going to be talking about military affairs, veterans affairs, and the political situation of the Koreas. And I'm here with Mike Kim. I'm going to give a little disclaimer on this today because my knowledge of Korea is more from familial and firsthand experience. My mom's sister-in-law is Korean. My two cousins are half Korean, and I lived in Korea for 3.5 years myself, for 2 years in Yongin-si, in Gokyo-do, and then for a year in Jeonju, in the center of the country. A place that I was told was rural when I lived in Korea, which I laugh at because it's, triple the population, it's like double the population of the city I live in now. But compared to Seoul, is pretty rural. And I have been to the DMZ. I have spoken to Chosungguk, which North Koreans. And I do elementary level read Korean, and as you can tell, I can butcher it when I speak it. 한국어 잘 못해요, meaning I don't speak it very well. But I am here with Mike Kim, and Mike also has a Korean background, Korean American, and you're also a former military, correct?
Yes, I am. And let me just say that you're actually more Korean than I am. You just don't have the eyes and the tan. But yeah, I really admire your kind of like ethnographic as well as ethnographic kind of like understanding of what's happening in the Korean peninsula, not just as far as like a meism, as far as I lived the experience, but more as far as when you talk about Korea, you talk about the cultural impact of how you've engaged the Korean culture, and I just think that says volumes.
Yeah, I mean, Korea is a culture that when I went to Korea now 13 years ago, had a kind of hidden cultural relationship to the United States. I mean, in the aughts, for example, it was hard to find a Korean restaurant if you weren't in a major city, if you weren't on the West Coast. It was, I used to joke, but it was true. Like most of the Japanese restaurants I went to were actually owned by Koreans. Like I went through this whole fascination with the origins of Japanese American food, which I discovered was really fusion Korean Japanese food from California, which wasn't marketed as Korean food. I was in Korea when Psy released Gangnam Style, which I never understood why it was, I mean, other than the funny dance, why it was popular in the United States, because it's not normal for K-pop. Actually, K-pop weirdly is designed to be played on US radio and never was until after Psy. And I should say this, K-pop is designed to be played and listenable anywhere in the world. It is like I don't want it to sound like there's nothing Korean about it. That's not true. There's something very Korean about it, but its target demographic is like, this should be something that people in China, people in Europe, and people in America can recognize elements of. It was made as a cultural import. And
Yes.
in the way that actually like anime in Japan was made as a cultural export.
But you're doing more justice to it than, and I love Cornel West, even though when I met him, he wasn't as you know what I mean. Maybe he was tired. He did the exam in life, and met him at the theater in the restroom. So usually you shouldn't be talking to other people in the restroom, but I was just like, trying to talk to him, and he just like looked at me as if like whatever, But I guess what I'm trying to say is this: that when he's talked about Korea, he's mentioned K-pop, and then he just says BDS, and that's it. What you've just done is help people understand as far as that this K-pop thing is a purposely orchestrated import in many ways, and as you've done a lot with. And here's shout out to Pascal Robert, who at times does not pick up my my emails, but Fantastic Baby by who was that group? I forgot that one. But anyway, I dedicate that song to him, Fantastic Baby. But anyway, the thing that you have knowledge of is that, and what you talk about in your show, and what This Is Revolution talks a lot about is, this thing about like countries hitting the end of like their capitalist peak, right? And so what else can they do, right? So Korea was just basically like using K-pop, copying Japanese anime to spread it around the world in many ways to create, some extra, revenue for the country,
Yeah, I mean, I think people need to understand a couple of things about Korea, and it's kind of cliche if you know Korean culture, because you hear this in talking points. It's like something they'll tell the tourist, but like their main export is people. Now, what's funny about that? All right, that wasn't always true. In the 70s, during the height of, I believe, the Park dictatorship, their main export was actually textiles, and Korea. South Korea, and I should be specific because I often think of Han as South Korea and Choson, even though they both come from the Choson dynasty, as North Korea, because that's what they are in Korean. Like the whole South and North Korean is a lot clearer in Korean. The countries have different names, but. Because actually they're claiming different parts of their historical past, even in those names. But one of the things I found fascinating is I learned the history of Korean business and the chaebol system, which is very similar. The only other country that has a system like it, and it is a little different, it is the Japanese corporations. Like, so you have these mega corporations that are conglomerated, but unlike in America where people hide conglomeration, and in the chaebol system, it's like family owned, and it's like there's like 5 companies that you see on everything. It's like, Lotte, which you don't have that much of in the United States, but then like Hyundai and stuff like that, which you do, or Hyundai, actually. I pronounced it the American way.
No,
but
that's fine.
But what I found interesting about that is you learn how the Korean relationship to globalization is specific. So when there were laws passed in the early, I believe in the late 60s, early 70s, to limit textile imports from Korea, which was their main import to the United States, what they did was take their factories to Bangladesh and then kind of franchise that out. And they basically use that to get around the import quotas and also establish their own capital. And so their own capitalist base. So what was fascinating is you see a country that was being used in the normal periphery country manner, actually, during its early dictatorship period. And these chaebols look at the US model and mimic it for both its best and in some ways worst aspects, which is they found a way to outsource the labor. But then they, instead of just undercutting the labor, they realized that Korea it has natural resources, but it's a plateau that's effectively an island because of the closedness of the DPRK, and it's mountainous as fuck. So there's not a lot you can do other than manufacture stuff and then import talent. So they kind of went through their industrialization phase and their outsourcing of that industrialization phase super fast.
Yeah,
I mean, like super fast.
Just to add, yeah, and I want to add that because a lot of Americans don't understand it. And I know when I took I was in my doctoral program, we're allowed to take courses at different places, and I don't know, I ended up going to, while at Columbia, going to Fordham to take some stats course, but I was sitting in on like a negotiation course, and they were talking about the chaebols, and it's like they got it wrong. You could have taught the course because in many ways, like you said, they went super fast as far as outsourcing, and they got that from actually the Japanese, who did that. That was kind of part of like the American kind of Marshall Plan, the so-called Marshall Plan for the Japanese was to allow so that in many ways the Americans wouldn't have to do that dirty work, but to set up these companies, down in Malaysia and all that, Indonesia and everything. And then later on, the South Koreans ended up doing that.
Yeah, I mean, they did it. I mean, particularly with Bangladesh, actually, was the big place that a lot of these South Koreans moved their manufacturing to, and they didn't do it initially. What I found interesting is they didn't do it initially to find cheap labor, actually, even though that was a benefit. Their labor was already fairly cheap. They did it to get around customs to their major export market, which was the United States.
Good point.
And South Korea, I think people also don't really understand this, was under a capitalist dictatorship that one might even call it a corporatist dictatorship, really. Like not just in its corporations about the chaebols, but also like it had a semi-fascist, like it had stuff that I used to talk about. Like they deliberately adopted elements of Soviet style planning, but for privatized capitalism, all the way back.
Even to the point, and you said it before I did. I wish I did, because I would have looked better. But you said something about the labor issue, and even to the point where, right, the U.S. gets into problems with Vietnam, right? They need, troops to do the dirty work, almost kind of like mercenaries. And they deployed a lot of troops over there. People don't realize the number of troops, 60,000. But that was part of the deal. Again, like what you're saying, what Park Chung-hee did that in many ways for economic reasons, not so much of a thing to knock out communism or anything like that. But it's an economy, much like what you're saying about the Soviet model in a way, if I'm getting it right, that labor is important, and they're going to strategically use Korean lives to make it happen, just like what North Korea is doing right now as far as going, people don't realize made in China is probably made by a North Korean, like in some northern Chinese region,
right. Yeah,
You know,
yeah. Most people don't know the history. Like, it's actually funny. There was a scandal early on in the Trump administration where Trump talked about how part of Korea was in China, and all the liberals were like, no, it isn't. And I was like, actually, yeah, it is. There is a part of the Choson dynasty that was annexed by Manchuria in like the 17th or 18th century, that is now the Korean Autonomous Prefecture. And yes, there's a ton of North Koreans who do labor in that region. There's also even ethnic tensions between not just North Korean defectors, but also what in Korea would be the I think it's like the Chinmyeok, which is like the Korean, we would translate it as to Chinese Korean, are Chinese of Korean blood. But there are tensions around that sub-ethnicity coming from, immigrating from China, and you'll sometimes hear them referred to as Chinese, but they are by Koreans, but they're ethnically Korean. They read Korean. They write Korean in Hanja or in Chinese script, not in Hangul. So there's that. But so they can basically get Chinese state documents. They don't really have to translate them.
Yeah, and I even think Un's grandfather was born in China.
Yeah.
Right. He was born in China. So there's that connection too, in many ways that cannot be overlooked and that a lot of Americans aren't familiar with.
Right. I mean, so like historical, one, the cultural and political region that we loosely call Korea has been of various sizes at various different times. It's always included what we would now consider North and South Korea, but it's sometimes been larger. At certain times, it's been smaller. It's also been several states at once, but they all were on the same general cultural group. Like during the Shilla period, or so there's all this stuff. There's also the fact that I use the word Minyok. Minyok is, it means Korean race. It's actually an interesting word because it doesn't exist. Yeah, it doesn't exist in Korean before the 20th century. There's not a word for it. It comes from Japan, and it's a Japanese word that was actually imported into Korea, but it was from German ideas of blood race. Yeah. So like, and I sometimes simplify this, but in some ways it's true that neither North or South Korea were ever denazified in terms of their racial and blood ideologies because the Americans didn't think highly enough of Asians to do it. Like they just didn't think it was a problem. Those are slur word that actually is the Korean word for person. And so we don't care if we tamp down on these racial ideologies, these blood ideologies. And it's so much that it even, in fact, it comes up in weird ways, like the blood type personality. And like, when I'd be like, my blood type is AB negative, and people like, oh, it explains so much about you. And I'm like, I don't really know what it explains about me, but whatever.
Right. And I have O positive. And I remember the first time I joined the military, they said, you're O positive. That's a very kind of like Asiatic, kind of like, blood type. And guess what? You're like, it's like a very very few people have it, but like, it's a very like diverse kind of blood type, And so I just thought it was interesting that even that was shared with me,
Yeah, that's fascinating. So, did you serve in Korea?
No, so with my military background, and I didn't mean that kind of like take you into another realm when you were doing the introduction. So just a brief background. So I'm Korean American. At the same time, I'm part of the diaspora, where my dad basically, after kind of being a civilian and also as, I don't know, like a teen. I wouldn't even say he was like so during the Korean War, basically from Incheon to Seoul, taking the kind of like whatever, like do guard duty or whatever. But then later on, with Sungmin Rhee and everything, and he had to go back into the military, and serve time and all that. And so, it put like a bitter taste. And as you know about the Jeju situation in 1948 with the botched elections and all of this, the deaths. A lot of people don't realize that the deaths in Korea, there were like estimated, even Noam Chomsky recognizes like 100,000 dead before the Korean War actually starts in 1950, as far as like U.S. being somewhat there, not responsible, but letting a lot of this stuff kind of go, as a lot of colonialists have done, in the past. But anyway, so my dad kind of had sour grapes and ended up serving, being proud of his service, but just wanted something different. So he ended up in Latin America. And then he was in Latin America because back then they were very welcoming, in Argentina and Paraguay and other places, Brazil. And then my dad ended up in the United States. He met my mom. My mom's from the Dominican Republic and was used to Asians because in the Dominican Republic, Santo Domingo, much like Fidel Trujillo, the dictator, he allowed, Asians to kind of like, create commerce and left them alone because they're not going to create any problems, So my mom was used to that, and that's what led to marriage. And then I ended up, growing up in kind of like a busted up part of Florida, economically depressed part of Florida. And the military for me was like way out. And I was just fortunate because I was able to serve in the military. I was able to also graduate through scholarships from Norwich Military College, where I got a commission. Now I took on an earlier commission before graduation, so I commissioned in the Coast Guard. Prior to that, I was in a Marine Special Operations Capable Unit, 4th Anglico. It was a reserve unit, but still within the Special Operations community. I had to go to jump school. I had to go through some type of selection. Then I become a Dominican Friar for about 10 years. And then I go back after 9/11. I go back into the military. So I go back into the military. It takes a while. And before that, I pick up a hybrid position with the VA that allows me to work with the military as DOD. So I was able to still kind of like progress in rank and do interesting work. And then, yeah, and as I was able to go to the military, I was able to go to Iraq during the surge. But it was really interesting. I came across Korean troops, and actually I was featured in the Korean Times, and I'll send it to you because you could maybe read it or whatever, find it kind of animating. But like my experience with Korean troops in Iraq, who were ironically enough well received because of their Mongolian roots, and as you know, Genghis Khan conquered Baghdad in that area. But yeah. So that's kind of like my military background.
Okay. So one of the funniest things is I am, for a Western person interested in linguistics, I'm one of the few people who believe in the Altaic language theory. And the reason why I believe it is Turkish and Korean are really easy for each other to learn, and I have no idea why, except for like vague Asian steppe, dispersal reasons. Because I'm like, I know you guys say that there's nothing to the Altaic language theory. I mean, a lot of people will tell me that you can't even say that Korean and Japanese are related. I'm like, BS. Like they're not mutually comprehensible, but they have the same particle system and like.
Well, the Turkish troops during the Korean War had a very close connection in many ways with Korean troops, and they still kept on, for decades, very close, kind of much more closer than like U.S. Korean troops as far as fellowship organizations and things, exchange kind of programs.
Yeah, I was about to say, one of the things when I was in Turkey, I could actually always find a Korean restaurant, which was weirdly comforting to me, because it's just like, I was even in like Selçuk, where Ephesus is, and I was like, there's a Korean restaurant here? Cool. Like, but and in some of my Turkish when I was we would go on vacation in Turkey when I was in Egypt, because it was cheap, and people would speak to me a lot of time in German, but if they knew that I knew any Korean, I had a lot of my Turkish they spoke English, but they were much more comfortable in Korean. And of course, like, my Korean's really bad, but like, I can kind of follow them. I say that though because I think the U.S. it is weird. The reason why I began this way back talking about the kind of secret history of Koreans in America is like, Korean Americans have been a bigger part. Like, there are way more Korean Americans than, say, Japanese Americans, honestly. Yeah. Like a lot of Japanese Americans left after the internment camps, et cetera, and so forth. It's actually one of the few countries where it's pretty easy to, like, if you get married to a Korean, they can move to the United States really fast. There are preferential treatment laws, which is weird. But like I could be like, okay, so if I'm different places I've lived, I'm like, okay, if an American marries a Korean, their spouse can come in 2 months, where if an American marries a Mexican, it'll take a year and a half to 2 years to even get the green card, much less anything else. I could go on about immigration policies even through marriage in the United States. It's kind of, I don't think most Americans really understand the depth of the problem, but there's a huge Korean American community, but until the last 10 years, I feel like it's been kind of invisible. And I also feel like, other than DPRK scary, because that was the first in 2010 when I went to, now admittedly, it was right before the Yongpan Island shelling, semi-shelling, and right after the sinking of that ship whose name has left my mind. I should have looked it up, but it was in that time period.
Yeah.
But I remember becoming aware of U.S. propaganda when I was in South Korea, because everybody would be freaking out, but before I left and when I was over there, about the threat of nuclear attack. Now, I had military based friends who, and you might understand this. They were at Kunsan, not Incheon. So that means they were officers, not the people they put in Seoul to get blown up in case of an actual attack. And they would tell me if I actually needed to be worried. And only once did it get real bad. And it wasn't when the US was actually saying it was really bad. There were some times where Koreans were legitimately afraid, but I would hear even NPR go find like the one Korean in Seoul who was really freaked out about the possibility of nuclear attack, and everyone I knew was like, with the exception of the Yongpan Island shelling, was always like, they just do that. Like, don't worry, it'll pass. Eat your fried chicken here, have some some beer, and like, chill out, American boy, you'll be fine. Like,
I think that it's interesting you say all that, because the narrative, the counter narrative, and I think even your show on so many levels, what I appreciate is that there's always room for counter narrative, and yeah, it's important to look at narratives and the different layers of narrative. But I think in an authentic, not in an oppositional or anti-American or anti-this or anti-that kind of way, there's room for counter narrative. And I think that as we're talking here, I can't help but to think about the counter narrative of, you know, just thinking about like the armistice, right? Like just, you know, people think, oh, the North Koreans are they're gonna do this, they're gonna do that. Like you said, you know, this period of like, you know, whatever it is, you know, CIA propaganda or whatever, or just even Korean, you know, there's a lot of from the conservative group that put people in fear. So to a certain extent, I always want to like, you know, kind of read a lot of this stuff and see, well, maybe that's more CIA influence, maybe this is more KCIA influence, or maybe this is more conservative party folks, you know, pushing that. And now you have the other layer, which is really common now from the election that just happened, was that grandmas started, you know, asking their grandchildren, how do I do a YouTube video? And those became very popular as far as bringing back the conservative spirit in Korea, and using the rhetoric of, you know, Park Chung-hee, you know, got us out of the communists, brought back the economy, all of this kind of stuff, modernization. And it's like these grandmoms doing these private YouTube videos that circulated that had some influence as far as, on top of the anti-feminist movement and the Jordan Peterson a la Korea style type folks.
Korea has a huge incel movement that I actually saw, like I saw beginning when I was there in 2012 and 13, but it had not taken off yet.
Let me ask you this: what would you think was distinctive, or what is distinctive between that incel movement and the one in Japan?
Oh,
in many ways, just I mean,
distinctive. It's
like a hopelessness. Did you notice that because like there is something about, you know, GDP not being 6% anymore?
Oh yeah.
Right.
It was I will say that my students, both male and female, even though I mean, this is a totally unfair generalization, but for an American spending time in Korea, we would always say like, well, it's like living in the future, but with the social norms of the early 1960s, and you're seeing the late 1960s happen. But they're also like what I realized later was also like, but they're also at that same economic stagnation period. In fact, they're a little bit more advanced in it. That like Korea is compared to the United States, Korea is a much more, outside of the chaebol overlords, a much more egalitarian society, but not because of the way it's set up. It's not set up to be that way. It's just like, it's not like they have good social policies like that. Like the work week there is 52 hours.
But that was brought down. You're right, and that was brought down by Moon. Before it was 68, right?
It was 68 hours a week. Like we would always be told we had it good. Like, and there is weird things about, like, there are cultural perceptions there too, because the work week's so long, you're expected to put in your time, but you're not really expected to like care much. Like, so there was cultural misunderstanding between Americans who were like, I'm here to work and I'm here to work now, but like, I'm not staying a moment after you, you know, if you're not paying me. So that was definitely there. And they're talking about undoing that 52-hour work week. But the other thing is like Korean women make something like 40%, like 40 to 50% of Korean men. Like the wage gap there is absurdly high. Like, and I think it's the highest in the OECD, or the second highest in the OECD. So there's that. The banning of blood money, you know what that is, maybe. But for my listeners, in Korea, you can pay a fee to the courts. It's totally legal. It's not bribery, and it doesn't go to the judge. As like a blood price blood price is the wrong thing because you can't do it for murder, but I think the early.
I think my family had to do that. because of, and I won't go into details, but maybe I will in my memoirs. But as you know, the country in war, you know, I studied a lot of counterinsurgency and insurgency in the military, as well as in military college. It's really interesting, you know. My uncle, you know, so my dad was very much, I wouldn't say pro, like, you know, Sung Min Rhee, but you know, my dad went with the program. My uncle actually didn't. So, you know, basically to get him okay, he, you know, when he went up as a guerrilla fighter and to formally reconcile all of that, he had to do what you had just said.
You had to pay a big chunk of money to a court. Well, they finally got rid of that for spousal abuse and for sexual assault. When in the first few years that I was there, because South Korea is a remarkably safe place. Particularly as a foreigner, but pretty much as anybody, you can, you know, like, you'll get embezzled from, but like you could drop your wallet on the street and no one's going to touch it. That's true, actually, because I've done it. The only time anyone's ever stole my stuff when I was drinking in Korea was actually American soldiers. It's interesting because they changed those laws really late because there was a scandal of spousal abuse, and there was another scandal around a foreigner, I think an American or an Australian, being sexually harassed, where they finally got rid of the blood money so that they would have to recognize it as stats. Because one of the things the blood money did is it was a way of saving face, but it also, the Korean government liked it because it kept it off the books.
Yes, it was a mediation, some type of mediation thing that's able to be reconciled. And like what you said, you're not going to have a narrative chasing you, especially if it came to politics in the future.
Right, and this is a very, like, I hate culturally essentializing, but it's really hard not to mention that this is a culture where honor and public face really matters. Yeah. It fair. Really does.
It's tied to It's a Confucianism that's more Confucian than China.
Yes. Yeah. Well, that's just
you could get into some of that too.
Like Neo-Confucianism in Korea, they used to joke, like my Korean friends used to joke with me, my more educated ones, that like every American's a Christian even when they're not, and every Korean is a Confucian even though everybody's either a Christian or a Buddhist. Like, are shamanists, like, but they're like, the cultural norms are Neo-Confucian, and they're in a way that is like, those who are familiar with the Chinese classics and what, you're not going to recognize this. This is filial piety on crack. Like, and there is, like, we used to talk about like a juicy disease, right? So like old Korean men who are because they're in a Confucian culture, you cannot, like even me as an American who's normally outside of the social hierarchy, like, I could say stuff to Koreans that most people couldn't get away with, and actually it made me more popular because you also could drop it with me. Right. But with old Korean men, you just knew, like, you can't. You're like, he can be the biggest ass he wants to be. You can't say anything about it. But we would talk about this disease because occasionally, like, elderly Korean men would like get on planes and get kicked off for doing stuff like with Americans in an American context when they're not on like Korean Air or somebody's more used to it. And I'm like, no, you can't do that here. But in general, what I found when I was there is that was like, that social norm really was changing rapidly. But at the same time, you were seeing this incel movement because like a lot of people just expect this. Marriage rates in Korea, women marry late and a lot of women don't marry at all because and again, I don't want to culturally sensibilize because it is changing, but because of the Confucian, the Neo-Confucian household norms are so crushing, particularly on daughter-in-laws that
Yeah.
it discourages marriage. And so
yeah, and not only that, people don't realize, the social system, the social welfare system was always Confucian as far as taking, you don't seek the state to take care of it, right? So now we have a neoliberal economy, hyper neoliberal economy. Labor, because of Kwanju, in my opinion, because of Kwanju riots in 1980, labor is suppressed because Kwanju is a place where labor and students come together, right, against the government. And later on, you've got labor at the peak, 1989, 20%, and much like the United States, pretty much goes back down to like 10%. It's 10%. So then, with all that going on, there's workers don't have rights, and then you've got this limited opportunity for women laborers to kind of like take care of the harmonies and all that kind of stuff, and harabajis and that grandparents, and just like you kind of outlined, you've got problems there, and because of all of that, the Korean family system is fractured. There's no formal social service type of system to manage that, and especially now, and that's why I think the election was so close, was because pandemic wrecked small business. Even though it did really well as far as maintaining, pandemic, kind of like isolation and all that, it really killed small business. And so the family structure was fragmented because of all of these different things that we're talking about.
I mean, this is the other thing that we have to this is a very petite bourgeois economy for a lot of people. Like if you're a woman and you can't get in a chaebol, or if you're even an old man, what are you going to do? You're going to drive a taxi. Informally, sometimes you're shut out of corporate employment, like legally. So you're going to open up a vegetable stand. You're going to do all these, like you're going to open up a Korean fried chicken place, like
sewing.
Yeah, you'll do tailoring, like you'll go, like I'm not gonna lie, like particularly when I was bigger, I would just go and get all my suits done in Asia because people will do it for, I mean, I would overpay it. I would pay foreigner price, and it would still be $200 for a well-made suit. I mean, like,
yes.
And foreigner price is jacked up because you can't hide that you're white. And frankly, I also made enough money that I didn't care. Like, so it was, but I saw that, and I already saw a couple of things happening. So we started seeing, so Korea and actually Mexico are places where like you had Korea has pretty decent public infrastructure, but what I started noticing was like, okay, who's cleaning up the streets? It's old ladies who don't have family support because they'll pay them like by the bag for recycling trash. And then who are all my taxi drivers? Oh, there are all these old retired men who don't have enough because the pension's not enough. And you're seeing like people driving well into their 80s. And while I will say Korean healthcare is semi-socialized and pretty good.
Yeah.
Like, at least in the major urban areas. It can be a little sketch actually if you're in the rural areas, particularly if you don't speak Korean. But it's a pretty impressive social. But that was the only social safety net that I saw that was super strong. Drugs for that were not. I'm sure they receive government subsidies. I'm actually absolutely sure they do, but it was that was not socialized in the same way. And a lot of other services were pretty much ad hoc, and you would see all these the pension system there is kind of based off the idea that the oldest working person in the family could support both the elders and the children. And also you live in these tight apartments because there's like and I gotta explain the housing rules because the only other place like it on earth is Japan, and it's weird. Because you don't buy a place in most scenarios, but you also don't rent it. You put down, or you pay rent, but you put down key money. But key money can be up to $300,000 or $400,000 in amount, and then you still pay some rent on top of that. And so what the landlord does is they take the key money and invest it. And if you leave, you get it back because you don't own the place. But and you'll pay like $200, the equivalent of $200 a month. But this means that, like, if you don't have inheritance, you cannot get a place because the key money is going to be in most places absolutely prohibitive. There are some non-key money apartments, but they're modern and rare, and they're a concession to the fact that young people, people up to into their 30s were not being able to move out with their parents even when they got married. And Korea is another culture, like actually most other cultures I've lived in, except for the United States, where you simply do not move out of your parents' place until you get married, which is why there's all these kinds of public entertainment, because these apartments are small. So you have stuff like norebongs or DVD bongs. Bong means room. For my audience, I know you know that. Where people go out because there's no space in these apartments to do much of anything but sleep and maybe watch TV, and if you eat a meal with your family. But also groceries are so expensive in Korea that it is often cheaper to go out to eat. So like it's a very strange and hyper privatized economy. And the chaebol system, to tie it all back together, and I'm just like blabbing about my experience in Korea, but you're actually giving a better kind of overview, and that's what I'm doing. A lot of my research in the area of Asian American, post 9/11 Asian American veterans, and my research focuses a lot on the ethnography and ethnographic narratives, because you could have read something or have seen a show and just spew it out, but you're actually giving life to explaining daily life, much like what you were like your Flanaire, what Walter Benjamin was kind of like talking about, like just like really trying to capture daily life and sharing that, because that's giving you a more robust story as far as understanding how things, not necessarily this is true, this is not true, but how things are moving on a day-to-day level involving the economy, the culture, sociology, and history. The one thing I would say is if you're in Seoul, you could live a life as an expatriate that you did not see any of this, like, or very little of it. Like all the restaurants have English on the wall. Like you will find other expats there, or at least other. Well, you probably won't find Americans, but you'll find enough people who speak English that you don't have to interact with people in Korean. You don't really have to look at the system. As soon as you get your worker's ID card, if you're a worker there and you're in Seoul, you can get medical care. And as soon as that's done, you pretty much don't care. You pay your taxes. You get most of your taxes back when you leave. You go home. Like, for me though, because I actually lived in Yongin-shi, which is near Bundang, which is rich, but Yongin-shi is just this little area between Suwon and Bundang outside of Seoul. So it's still like in
was it conservative? Would you say it was a more of a conservative municipality, or
yeah.
It was.
It's a very.
I want to get into that. I want to get into that in the future, like the differences. You can help me. We can talk about some of that.
It was a conservative municipality. It was kind of a little town actually. But it was near not Gangnam, which everybody now knows, but like Bundang was like second Gangnam, but this was a place that was the reason why my campus was out there, which was the international campus of Hankook de Hakyo, or I think in English that would be Hankook University of Foreign Studies. I think is his English title. Yeah. But anyway, so I was on there. I was out there, and on campus, everything's in English, including even like the Korean faculty is communicating about half the time in English. But the moment you step off campus, this is a rural place where, like, I don't know how to, this is going to sound absurd to people, but like I would have little kids who were used to seeing like the white teacher on TV or at school, when they would take the one American and like, but like they had not seen foreigners, particularly pale foreigners in the wild, and they were like, follow me around. Like, and and it was fascinating because outside of the children who all spoke very simple, rote English, it was actually that I could do a whole thing on the weirdness of the Korean English education program and what it was. I'm
curious.
Well, I mean, they basically had this frankly, kind of racist notion that you could import anybody with a degree in any subject. This has changed now, but this was in the early aughts and aught teens, to come and teach Hagwons after school, so much so that the prestige of teaching went down, because you were a Hagwon Sunsunim, nobody respected you. You were pretty much like, but then they had the same standards for a while for the public school program. They just hire anybody from Canada, the United States, Britain, Ireland, Scotland, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand.
Well, as you know, and you probably caught this, one thing that the audience can kind of pick up on from our dialogue is that in many ways we've indirectly engaged the issue of, and I'm almost kind of looking at this from a Lacanian view, because you're talking about how you're kind of saying this. Correct me if I'm wrong. That if you could have been like a Cornell, whatever background Korean person teaching, and you wouldn't get the respect.
Oh, no.
As a white person who came in to teach English.
Well, for one thing, you better have actually been white or Asian. You better not be two things. Either black or half Asian or Japanese. Don't be a Japanese American. But like, there was a racial hierarchy in a lot of this area, and like there was kind of a morbid sense of humor that, like, oh yeah, white people are subhuman and we spread AIDS. And there was literally a documentary, like a conspiracy documentary about this actually when I was there. But we were the best subhumans. Like, like,
but as far as teaching goes,
we automatically would get it just for being. So now my job was different. My job in Korea was to come and teach Korean teachers how to speak English. A lot of them spoke English, frankly, better than me, but how to speak English in an approachable way internationally, to remove their Konglish, which are the results of the particular way they teach English in Korea, and a lot of English, South Korean hybrid slang, which is peppered all throughout the language now. And to teach them teaching methods that were popular in the United States, because while the Korean education system is brutal, and it's no stakes and all stakes, so you're not going to fail a grade, but if you fail a test, you might as well kill yourself.
Now, let me ask you this, because, and I want to go back to this kind of like Lacanian kind of view on this. But in a way, they saw you, and you're articulate, you know what you're talking about. They had a certain sense of confidence. You're white. If you're the signifier teacher is much more powerful. This is what I'm saying. Because of everything that you represent, the image that you represent, which is also tied to substance, but because they're so caught up with a lot of signifiers that the signified, in many ways, the narrative of different types of signification of your background wasn't as important. I'm just bringing that up.
Oh, I would
you were
totally agree
highly
with that.
revered probably on many levels because of your appearance.
Oh yeah, and because of my title,
right?
I mean, it was because of my appearance. I mean, it was
appearance as far as not just the way you look outwardly, but to communicate with them, to have a dialogical,
oh yeah, I mean, also like,
you know,
there was also, I was also in a sweet space limit, like in this liminal space where they knew that I was trying to speak Korean and doing a good job, but I hadn't been there long enough that they could judge me for it.
Right. And they'd be like, oh, they'd almost objectify you.
Right.
As like almost.
But there is a shadow side to it too. I mean, like you would talk about like the psychoanalytic view.
Yeah.
Because when I actually started learning Korean slang, I realized what other people said about me. So there was like this automatic respect that you got, but as soon as you weren't in that context, there was just strong resentment. And
was the resentment though? Let me ask you this, and this is what it could happen in military operations in Vietnam with Korean soldiers and American soldiers, from what I heard. But at times, if you did try to provide any type of direction, that it would be almost as a shaming effect, even though they knew you were right, even though you know what I mean? Like it was almost as super ego on their end was so overwhelming that it blocks them off from any sense of reality of the practical.
I would say not to overgeneralize, but I would say amongst middle age, so people who were now be in their 50s. This was 10, 15 years ago. Amongst middle-aged Korean professionals, there was an outward respect, although it was different than in Japan, where like no one ever showed me anything but the utmost politeness. In Korea, it was like I wasn't just a Sun Sunim, I was a Go Sunim. So I was a lecturer, I was a professor. So like I literally got like credit card offers that foreigners couldn't normally get. I got cell phones that it was weird.
You've got Sage status.
Right.
You got Sage, yeah.
And you know the 5 questions, right? Are you married? What's your age? What's your job? And I mean, literally, and people need to understand this about the Korean language. If someone doesn't know this about you, they literally cannot speak to you because they cannot address you in the correct register. And even though in English they don't have to do that, it was just the beginning of conversation. Like, are you married? What's your age? What's your education level? And then it was interesting because these are things that Americans are not used to answering. They're
true.
But it's also interesting what they don't ask. Like, they don't ask your religion. They don't ask. But so there's all that. What I came to realize, I think, is everything you're talking about. There's both a Confucian hierarchy. There's the exoticness of the foreigner. I was qualified for my job, but there are people I worked with who frankly weren't. And who had positions higher than me because they just got hired at a certain time, and they would just take like any old foreigner with a master's degree at this university, or maybe maybe less. Like, and so this led to kind of a dual tension, right? Because a lot of people knew that if they were Korean, they would have busted their ass a lot harder to get a lot more credentials to get this chance. But also, they really wanted the American cultural expertise. And actually, as an American, because we were rare, the number one ethnicity for like teachers in Korea, even though we know about all the hagwons from the United States, is actually Canada, because Canada overproduces highly qualified teachers. The U.S. needs highly qualified teachers. Not like we'll pay them, but like, so if you you could hire a Canadian with actual credentials to come and do some of these jobs, whereas an American, you get whoever had a degree. So there's all that there, but there was literally like like the I would get anti-foreign sentiment, but the only time I ever got anti-American sentiment was specifically in areas where there was a U.S. military base. So, like, if I was in Incheon, problem. Like, if I was in this is going to be nothing to half our listeners, but I go to like Hyundai, which is the other Korean party area in Seoul. It's it's near Seoul National University. It's near Seouldae, or Seoul Women's College. It's somewhere between them. And Hyundai is cool, but American expats are allowed there, but American soldiers are not. They are specifically forbidden from that goo. So like, and so the way I was treated would be night and day different. So like we would deliberately go to Hyundai or Gangnam because we didn't have the stigma of the hostility to American forces. Now, there was still times where there'd be like anti-American sentiment that like would come at me about something that I had absolutely no control over, in ways that didn't happen in other countries. So like when there was a beef export issue, which was a weirdly passionate thing. It was. Like people got beat up over that, but in general, like that you get a vitriolic anti-Americanism, and then you'd had a generation of people who remembered the Sigmund Rhee, the really old people. They would come up and like come up to you and scream like "Wekugen ka," which like is super insulting. Which for those of you who don't know, that's foreigner go home. Right. But it's meaner than that. Like that it's not profane, but it's shocking if you hear it in Korea and you're not used to it. But there was this very strange, like it was because I was foreign, but not because they didn't care that I was American. They didn't care that I was, they didn't care. It wasn't Miguk Ka, it was Wekugen Ka. Foreigner go away, non-Korean go away, not Miguk Ka, but which is American screw off. In Incheon that be different. In Incheon it might actually be aimed at Americans because it was aimed at American soldiers.
Right. And people don't understand. A lot of Americans they see, and you mentioned going back to your question about did I serve in Korea? I had a lot of friends from high school. Again, we end up joining, this redneck kind of Florida town. People join the military, and they're given opportunities to go to Korea. Back then in the 80s during the Cold War, and it's like I have my two closest friends going to Korea together, knowing nothing about the country, and incredibly good guys. But hearing their side, not that they did anything criminal or anything like that, I could tell that people would have issues because the way they describe, this is 1986, 1987, 1988, around that time, right? And so there's still at that time still influence from the regime. They're still, as far as a democratic Korea, moving towards a democratic Korea, it's still really not there yet. And it becomes really, really problematic, right? For these friends of mine who were just, because I was just like, why didn't you visit this temple? Why didn't you, and they're just like, well, we were just pretty much like focused on what we needed to focus on, within the entertainment and all of that kind of stuff. And Park Chung-hee actually used it, what a lot of Korean people don't realize, that, some of this is unwarranted, the hate towards American troops. And I'll say this objectively because you give me room to talk about military issues, is that Park Chung-hee actually promoted the prostitution, the vices, the black market in many ways to bring in American dollars into the economy. The regulated prostitution and all that. That wasn't, U.S. troops were definitely in on some of that, but it was really, these Korean generals that really had like a monopoly on a lot of that stuff, and it was sanctioned by Park Chung-hee. So a lot of this negative stuff, right? And you could see it like in the the memoir. I forgot who the North Korean. I don't know if you ever came across that story. I think maybe you have the Jackals, where it's really interesting because Jackals is basically saying in it that I got this from like this Dutch Korean studies guy. I think I forgot his last name. He's an interesting guy. I'll mention it in the comments because I want to give him credit. But led me to the memoir of this North Korean dissident. But basically, he's down during during the Korean War, down looking at people and noticing women, and the women are going with GIs and everything. And what's interesting is he's saying, I'm not against, guys got to do what a guy's got to do in his mentality. Not now. We're talking about that time, whatever, to get some sexual fun or release. I'm not blaming these American troops for that, but I'm blaming it. I'm having problems with all this because they're actually with Korean women, and that's what breaks his heart. And I think some of the nationalism, the anti-Americanism, is against American troops. And I also noticed it when looking at the Korean War. Now you've got a lot of movies. The movie about the Korean American troop atrocities at the bridge. What is it? Ren. The name of that bridge where those civilians were killed. There's an interesting movie in the book, won a Pulitzer Prize. You're starting to see counter narratives. You're starting to see Korean movies depicting, real Korean units that fought hard. When I was growing up, you'd hear Korean war vets, American Korean war vets say, and whatever, they weren't like in command situations, right? They'd say, they didn't fight well. They didn't do this well. They didn't do that well. They were criticizing Korean troops, but in many ways they didn't have their own. UN forces were under MacArthur. And MacArthur kind of like let certain incompetent generals kind of like lead certain, indiscriminate napalm bombings on villages, all kinds of the push to the 38th parallel. General Aldman, a very incompetent general who also had a lot of problems with African American troops in World War II in Italy, basically. Really was incompetent and led to a lot of Korean deaths, not just American deaths, civilian deaths, as well as Korean troop deaths. And in many ways, a lot of that anger is like hidden inside and comes out in what we're talking about right now. I'm not saying all of it. I'm just saying, I'm just bringing up some historical context that in many ways on different shows you're not going to get.
One thing I would say. One thing I would say that unfortunately I learned in Korea was that particularly some of those incompetent generals specifically used African American troops to do some of the worst things that happened with the Americans in the Korean War. And I ironically, this is not a good show. It's not honest to a lot of the Black racial experience of the 50s. But Lovecraft Country, one thing it actually got right was that, for people who don't know, and there's a lot of anti-Black animus. Specifically, there's anti-African animus too, and that's actually separate. But some of the anger specifically at African Americans and African Canadians, because they're confused for African Americans, is often attributed to the way some of those generals used Black troops during the war. And that's also true in Vietnam. Yes. Although in Vietnam, I only know this because when I was learning Korean, the best way to learn Korean is to drink with old Korean men in exchange for teaching them English. But I actually drank with some Vietnam vets who were like 30 years older than me. They were, and they were very hesitant to talk about it. And then when I was in Vietnam, one of the things that surprised me is like there's not, even though it's a communist country, even though there's a lot of anti-American government sentiment there, like I didn't experience any anti-American person sentiment in Vietnam. I mean, I was a tourist, but still I didn't experience it at all. And like I saw kids who were still being born with birth defects for Agent Orange, so I was totally expecting to get it, and I felt like it was earned. And I was just ready. I'm like, okay, I can handle it. I didn't get it, but what I did see was anti-South Korean sentiment. Because they were also those Korean mercenaries you were talking about were also employed for things that were considered too dirty for American troops to do.
Right. And they ended up doing, to a certain extent, what you had mentioned earlier in the Korean War with certain African American troops. Yes, you're right. And to the point where just to let you know, in as far as this ethnographic kind of discussion, my dad's second wife, after my mom died, was Vietnamese. She prematurely died of Parkinson's. We assume it was Agent Orange because it was quick. Just the way she died, it was definitely that, and we could conclude it's that. But she was exposed to a lot of combat, and she would talk about just the gruesome, a lot of the manipulation regarding Geneva warfare in many ways, because they were under their own command in Korea. So the Korean troops could kind of like go into certain areas and just like what you're saying.
I mean,
a lot of Americans don't realize that.
American GIs are bad enough in Vietnam, but yes, they did employ Korean soldiers because if they got in trouble, the U.S. Army didn't. So, that was venom. There's also venom about Korean men going to Southeast Asia to marry. Actually, it was described almost identical to the way like my uncle would describe American vets marrying Korean women in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Was the way these Korean men were describing them going to Vietnam to marry Vietnamese women, and it was skeevy. But
I need to. I'm pressed to ask you a quick question because you mentioned this. So the Justice Party, I think I mentioned to you, has got 2% of the votes. Now they're very progressive. They're, some people even see that like Moon was and Lee, they were kind of like Bernie. They did have kind of like Bernie kind of like ways to them. But this Justice Party is extremely progressive. They actually had, and I wanted to ask you about how the immigrant population, like Filipinos in Korea, were treated, because in the Justice Party they had this new figure, Jasmine Lee, I believe, and she was born in the Philippines. I think she was raised in Korea, and is trying to push for legislation, civil rights legislation for immigrants and minorities in the country. And I just wanted to I wanted to talk about this because people need to know a little bit of context, as far as we're not just saying, hey, whatever, this group was treated this way, or that group, American group, was treated that way. It's a problem, involving many other groups, and just I wanted to get like your perspective of that.
One thing I would say is a lot of Americans who complain about Korea when they're expats, yes, there's anti-foreign racism in Korea that's aimed at everybody who's not Korean, including and sometimes especially Kyopos, or Koreans who are raised abroad, are really aimed at half Koreans. Like that. I know a lot of people who move their kids out of the country because of the anti-half Korean sentiment. But that aside, the treatment of Southeast Asians, particularly Filipinas, and I'm gendering that on purpose, was, frankly, they were kind of brought over as on entertainment visas, and often quasi sex trafficked, and I mean, and there was a lot of anti-Southeast Asian sentiment, even to like Vietnamese wives and stuff. That was pretty common, and with Filipinos, that was extremely common. But there were a lot of Filipinas there. The Philippine diaspora, interestingly, has been every place I've ever lived, including in Egypt. And so the idea was you could bring them over. They were barred from joining Korean unions, and they could be deported at the whim of their boss. Now that was also even true for American educational labor until 2012, where they changed the law to where if we lost our job, if our Hagwon was closed or we were just fired summarily, that we would be allowed to stay for a month to find a new job, and no one would like come after us. Although usually your housing's tied into where you're to your job, so it's really hard to stay, but you could. At one point, actually, the U.S. State Department warned Americans not to take jobs in education in South Korea. That was changed, I think, in like 2009. But there have been reforms, but of course, the reforms first went to these expat teachers from Canada, the U.S., etc. Because when we went home, we talked about it in English. And that's a big problem. So Filipinos speak English, but they're not coming home to a country with the kind of clout that even a dipshit American expat would have. And so they don't have that weapon. And so if they get laid off from their entertainment visa job, they could be deported back to the Philippines overnight. So while they have, it is not like in the UAE or in the Gulf countries where they strip you of your passport and you really can be stuck in a quasi slavery situation. As people don't know that, you can, by the way, that's real. It is not like that, which is also something that happens to Pacific Islanders, Filipinos, and Southeast Asians. But it is a pretty precarious situation if you're not married to a local. Because the other thing you can't do is you can't own property really without a Korean also being in on it. And that's true for an American too. Like if I wanted to open up a small business in Korea, I need to be married to a Korean, or I have to have a lot of money. Like it's possible if I think it's possible to do it if you have a ton of money, but like, and to be fair, some of these laws I don't even disagree with because of the predatory practices done by American corporations in Asia. And like I always get a kick out of like, if you know the Emart story, Emart, where Walmart was brought in and
tell me.
Walmart was brought in like it was in the rest of the world, but
what happened?
The Koreans use their capital ownership clause to buy it out, kick it out, and then sell part of it to Tesco. So like they have British investment. So they took the Walmart infrastructure and then with British, with a little bit of British money, built a Korean British business off that infrastructure and set it up in Korea, which I was like, I was so like, oh, I'm like, I gotta admire the game in that you're the only country I know that screwed over Walmart.
You're talking about this, and people may say, Cornel West was calling people gangsters and all that, but it's more an issue of like, whether it's South Korean or North Korean, and you know this, and I know this, but a lot of Americans don't know this, that actually North Korea, was doing really well after Korean War.
In the 70s, we would have thought that North Korea would have been the richer Korea.
Right. So you've got all of that. So it's not just one decade, right? It's two or three decades of like moving upward. They're getting aid. They're working collectively with Chinese, the Soviets, mostly the Soviets at first, and a lot of Eastern European countries in regards to loans, right? So the bottom line, I mean, you said that about Walmart. The North Koreans, which have hurt the North Koreans, but to a certain extent, it was a way of survival, and for them not to go begging to the IMF or World Bank, because they borrowed money from the Bulgarians and they borrowed money from these other Eastern European countries. And basically, the Chinese did some debt forgiveness, the Soviets did some debt forgiveness, but even with all that going on, they just refused to pay back the loans, you know what I mean? And so it's so hard for them to, even if UN is trying to kind of go into, making a deal with the IMF and World Bank, it's like that indirect credit rating, because of that past history, is following them. But to a certain extent, if the country had to, and this is what a lot of people don't realize in regards to the military issues, and even a lot of like South Koreans don't understand it, and the young South Koreans don't understand it, especially within the veteran community, is that the North Koreans were pretty much not forced, but they just saw it to their best interest to get into this military industrial state that they were in, right? Because they had, they did really well, and then the famine, and then the Soviet aid is cut. They're kind of stigmatized, well before Bush. I mean, Bush made first Bush, second Bush, W. Bush makes things worse with the axis of evil type stuff. But, they're moving into a very difficult ground because they have limited capital, but at the same time, they're running a lot of stuff on their own, like the collective farms, and I'm not saying that this improves anything in regards to their image. They are an authoritarian country. They're a difficult country. I don't appreciate them, but at the same time, I can't deal with the mass culture narratives from Jordan Peterson and Youngmi Park. Have you ever followed her? She's got better English than me, went to Columbia University, and all of a sudden is talking about how she was human trafficked. I'm not saying she wasn't. I'm just saying the way she depicts North Korean culture. And I caught part of her narrative. She was saying, I was starving and there was no protein or something like that. Or Jordan Peterson was saying something about that. And all of a sudden she was saying something, yeah, but I could hear the cock crows in the morning, and I'd wake up in the morning and do my thing. And you and I both know, you wouldn't find chickens like in Ethiopia, during famine. You know what I mean? Like that. I mean,
yeah,
situation was grave, but not as grave, I don't think, as a lot of narratives come out to be, to demonize North Korea. And that's not giving North Korea a pass. But what I'm saying is we're also not understanding their narrative of survival in many ways, as far as saying, hey, we took out loans. I think the Japanese gave them loans too, but they've always had a fear of the Japanese kind of being allowed by the U.S. to kind of invade them too, because they were occupied by the Japanese, and much of the big problems that Park Chung-hee has with the grandfather of Un is because Un's grandfather was a guerrilla who fought it. It was like on the American side, not on the American side, but they helped defeat the Japanese in Manchuria and everything through real guerrilla warfare. And there were no reparations. The United States didn't make Japan have any reparations towards Korea. You know what I mean?
That's still an issue even in the South.
Right, exactly. And so the South has an issue. The North is going to have even more of an issue towards the Japanese, and anything that may be perceived as far as like, oh, you're getting over on us or whatever. And so to a certain extent, this issue of the militarism in North Korea, where a lot of Americans don't understand, it's a lot of the past constantly coming back, but not so much because they're just brainwashing them, but because there is a history tied to it. I mean, Theodore Roosevelt basically ordained the Japanese to take over Korea,
actually,
in the treaty, the famous treaty, right? 1905 or something like that.
The Incheon Treaty. I mean, that treaty is interesting because people don't realize, like, the Han Empire is given to Japan as reparations for Russia losing the Battle of Incheon. So the Koreans are totally not even the party that, like, it's two different imperial powers trying to claim the country. And Theodore Roosevelt basically gives it to the Japanese. This is not understood. It's not taught in American schools. It's something I discovered when I was writing on the Korean American author Teresa Parkunchi, the writer of Dictate, who I was obsessed with in my MFA. I learned the history of the Japanese occupation, the primitive selves mythology, the fact that the Japanese actually subjugated them, but did consider them the same people, but the primitive form, which they had to come in and force it to modernize because these are our primitive older selves. It's a very strange rhetoric they used. Actually, it was otherizing, but it was otherizing and paternalizing, but as opposed to the Manchurian, where it's like these Han Chinese we just need to kill off. But it was still semi-genocidal in the way they enforced it, and it leaves a specific mark on South Korean culture because, for example, there's all these old Korean phraseologies that actually come from Japanese that, like, North Koreans strip from their language. So one of the interesting things is North and South Korean are becoming very different languages because South Korean has a lot of German, a lot of Japanese, and a lot of English loan words, slang incorporated and Koreanized. And North Korea has a lot of Russian, a lot of Chinese influences like that, and a lot of communist talk. But the North Koreans have tried harder to actually purify their language. So to get to your point on political economy, I can't speak to North Korea except that I've met some defectors and some soldiers. The soldiers were tall, the defectors were not. And I say that because not as some kind of stereotype, but because it was nutrition. Like soldiers are fed well. And you see this in South Koreans too. Older South Koreans are all kind of small people. Younger South Koreans are just as tall as Americans, if not taller.
And my dad was tall, and something that my family has had to face, and I'm open about it, and it had, I'm a psychoanalyst, and going through I had to go through my own psychoanalysis and to face, the reality is the human stain that my grandfather was a laborer for the Japanese army and much, taken away from his family, sent to Manchuria, used as a laborer, and as luckily he had some, because he was a small landowner, he was allowed, just like what you were saying earlier is accurate, that the Japanese, it was just, you're subhuman, but you're you know what I mean, you can still live, you know what I mean?
Yeah, you're subhuman, but you are actually a primitive form of us, basically.
Right, exactly. So then he's up there, and there's pictures that at first I was not wanting to show, but you could see that he had to wear the Japanese imperial uniform, even though he wasn't involved in the army, but he was a laborer, and they made him wear that. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that all of this is in the psyche, right, of Korean people, especially the older groups, people like my dad, and they're very bitter because of that. And I guess why I mention that is because North Koreans have this huge disdain for the Americans, because in many ways the Americans, they have the enemy, the Japanese, and yet they feel that Americans have given them like this huge favoritism, whereas even before the Korean War, there were Koreans in the Soviet Union. And yeah, they were, whatever, indoctrinated to a certain extent, but they've had their issues in Korea after the World War II, integrating into North Korea. And I think American intelligence should have recognized that it's not like these North Koreans just showed up, as a military force and stormed South Korea, that they struggled themselves. I don't know if I'm missing my point with my original point that I was going with, but to a certain extent, I think a lot of Americans just kind of think, well, it's just like these communists that just came together and they just wanted to take over. And it's a lot more than that. And what I would say, if you look at especially the recent election, the stronghold for the progressives, a lot of those, they're progressives because they had families that family members who were killed, unnamed, their graves were destroyed. There was a truth commission that did happen, but it was never, Park Chung-hee and Sung Min-ri, they did a lot to prevent the dignity of these people. And that's why, even to this day, half the country, that's why if there is an attack, I think a lot of the liberals would not care. And that's why purposely an attack towards Seoul would be something that, because Seoul isn't politically a liberal kind of, progressive kind of area as far as politics go. You know what I mean?
So one of the most fascinating things about Korean history, and this is not me speaking from experience, this is me speaking from just formally studying this and talking about it, is like, for example, the Catholic Church has been in Korea for 700 years. It came over with Matteo Ricci when actually the Pope screwed up the whole Confucian Catholic hybrid thing the Jesuits were building in Asia, and it was literally the Pope.
It was the first indigenous church.
Right.
Have you heard about that? That they had their own bishops and everything, and it was like then the Romans found that the hierarchy found out, it was like, send these guys to get ordained, send them to Rome because they need apostolic succession. But they got it from the Chinese idea and try to replicate it.
But what's interesting about this is the North Koreans antipathy to the Americans comes later than people think. It comes from
missionaries or not?
No. I mean, so here's the funny thing. Until the 1940s, Korean Christians were more likely to be sympathetic to anarchists or communists in Korea.
Yes. Very true.
The Korean Buddhists were split on how much they would collaborate with the Japanese, who were co-religionists. But what was interesting is and you may say this, maybe this was a tactical error on the Soviets, I don't know. The Korean Christians, however, fled because of anti-religious laws, particularly aimed at Christians, towards the end. Now there are North Korean Christians, by the way. That's not like the missionaries who pretend like it doesn't exist. It does, but it's very controlled, very, very controlled by the state. And if you start passing out unapproved Bibles and this and the other, yes, you can easily find yourself in a prison camp. But it's not like there are no Christians in North Korea. But the anti-religious laws freak the Christians out. They fled to the South, and their co-religionists were Americans. And so you saw the political affiliation of Korean Christians flip overnight. But this has created a weird situation in Korean conservatism. One of the things that has helped Korean progressives win sometimes is that often there are religious distinctions between the kinds of conservatives in Korea. So the Lee Myung-bak versus the Park Geun-hye administration. So, you know, Park, the dictator's daughter, she was a Buddhist, and everyone knows about the scandals around some of the weirder stuff with her shamans and this, that, and the other, and the embezzlement and this, that, and the other. But well, probably everybody doesn't know that, but anyone who knows Korean,
but it was full of a lot of drama, that's for sure.
Right.
But to the point, tell the audience what ended up happened to her fate.
Well, she basically gets I mean, she's in prison now, I believe.
Right. She becomes one of the first, right? There was like how many 10 million people that showed up like against the candlelight in the 2017 vigil.
Right.
Peaceful. Yeah. That's where we can learn that it's not just about the vote, that actually if we, you know, got together with groups, which, you know, and I think, you know, race can be mixed into this, but like in the United States, but the common cause, you know, can be brought together in a very peaceful manner and successful. You know, we saw that there in that example. Yeah, I'm not saying it's easy or anything.
I agree. What I would say, though, is that it made it very hard for Americans to understand the tensions going on because both Pak and her competitor, I believe it's Moon then too.
Yes.
Moon was actually imprisoned by Park's father at one point, so which was a really crazy story. But they were both able to run as opposition to the Lee Myung-bak administration. Because the Lee Myung-bak administration was seen as he was always described as cunning, but he was described as like Korea's George Bush. He was Christian, he was Protestant, he was neoliberal. He was
a pastor, right?
Right.
Like, yeah.
And he was a softer neoliberal, whereas Park was seen as an authoritarian, maybe even what we in America would now call a national conservative. Like she might be interested in like working some with Korean labor as long as only for Korea, which actually didn't turn out to be true at all, but that's what they thought. And that maybe she would impose some of the economic prosperity planning that her father had done during the dictatorship. Some of the older people thought that might be a possibility.
That's true. That's true.
But because of the difference in religious affiliation, she was also able to run as one. They had a new conservative party. People don't realize Korean parties like dissolve and come back like every 4 years.
And they merge and do all kinds of wild things.
So both candidates in 2013 ran as anti-Lee Myung-bak. So like that was something that Americans just couldn't understand because they're like, well, but they're conservatives and but they're Buddhist conservatives and he's a Christian conservative.
Right.
And this is a society
and Boone is a Catholic who represents the first exposure to Christianity, and this other guy is more part of the Protestant Christianity that encourages a lot of the neoliberal policies to a certain extent of hard work ethic and all that mixed labor, a lot of that.
So I was about to say, a lot of Catholics I knew in Korea, and there isn't a large Catholic community in Korea, but it is an old community.
It is, and they have money.
Right. They are seen as being more sympathetic towards not the left, because I mean, technically speaking, people should understand this. Being a leftist, a Marxist, let me rephrase that, not a leftist, a Marxist explicitly in Korea is technically illegal, even though, yes, in English, I actually don't know in Korean, but in English, you can buy all kinds of Marxist texts, no kind of problem. They're readily available in even a corporate bookstore. Like, in fact, I bought more probably when I was really researching this. I was actually in Korea buying it, all kinds of stuff in English. But I was always reminded that, hey, you can do that. We'll even have a Marxism conference, but you better not say you're a communist in public, because if you do, like, it's totally okay that you're academically into Marx. But if you say you're a communist, you're in violation of the national security law, and as a foreigner, you're not going to get in that much trouble. They're just going to deport you, but they're going to deport you. And they're like, and I'm like, okay, I prefer not to be deported, thank you. My partner would be my partner, soon to be spouse, who is not Korean. I mean, we met in Korea, but she's not.
Cool.
My ex now, but would like, she would not be happy if I got deported. But it was really weird because, like many things in South Korea, like there's tattoo parlors in South Korea, but tattooing is illegal. There are abortion clinics. This goes back to the blood money thing. You normally pay the fee and get out of it. But the national security law is one of those things that is honored that they rarely ever actually throw it at you, but at any time they can.
They can.
And so they've broken up progressive movements in Korea by truly or falsely implying that they were communists and thus sympathetic towards the North, thus traitors. And so we can make this party illegal or this and the other. And that's happened multiple times. And then when I say multiple times in the last 20 years. So even though I can totally buy Slavoj Žižek or even Karl Marx or Lenin in a bookstore in English in Korea, I actually don't know if they're as available in Korean. I know Slavoj is though. I can totally get it, and it's no big deal. No, I'm not going on that. Even if I am going on national security list, no one cares. But the national security law can be in effect, which is why, for example, like everybody knows Parasite, but that director, I would know his name if we weren't talking about this right now. But like all his stuff is allegories for sympathy to the anti-American cause. He's slightly sympathetic. He considers himself some kind of Marxist. He's also a nationalist. In his stories, a Parasite, Guemul, the host or monster. It's the host in English. It should be translated as monster, but whatever. That director, he has all kinds of Marxist friendly allegories. He's totally okay. He's beloved in South Korea. You see this also in in Squid Games, but there's a limit to
how far,
and you can show how bad Korean capitalism is, but I've rarely seen an alternative posited directly. And that's important. So like, and somebody was complaining about like Parasite. Well, in this capitalist realism, I'm like, yeah, but like, if he was too explicit, and everybody knows this dude's a Marxist, it's not a secret, but like, if he was too explicit and seemed like he was advocating for communism, he could easily be in violation of the national security law. Like, and that's something that I don't think people understand. So there's a strong South Korean like critique of the neoliberalism in Korea, but you can't really offer an alternative without risking it coming back on you. And this is even true. Like we were talking about Moon, they have some progressive policies that definitely some what we would consider even social democratic leaning policies, but they also came down on the far left during COVID. So like it's a very fine line people walk. Now
it is, and they're part of the why, even though Moon, you can't really say too many bad things about him. What they did say is, and you're making me think, and I hope I covered the points before what we talked about, but this thing about communism, they feel as though Moon wasn't hard enough on communism.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the history of the Sunshine Policy. So, during Kim Jong-un's accession, there's a little bit of chaos. Then what he does, he starts to relax the military first policy because it is true there is a famine in North Korea, and that's a real famine. It went on for a long time. And
China's pressuring them.
Yeah, so he starts to make liberalizing gestures towards China, but he goes back and forth from this. Like they just got out of people don't realize this. They just got out of a session of hostility towards each other. China and Kim Jong-un were butting heads until about a month ago. I was just after the Olympics, during the first week of the Ukraine invasion, China said that it was going to try to come to better terms with North Korea because North Korea skipped the Olympics even, and there was some economic exchange going on, and a kind of tacit go ahead to you basically will tolerate you testing again. What people don't realize is that's partly aimed at the United States, but people have been thinking, oh, this is in the chaos of the Ukraine war. No, this is in the response to the conservatives narrowly winning the South Korean elections, not North Korean, because this gets us to the sunshine policy. The progressives I believe in the 90s came up with an idea of, okay, we will work with the communist government through the back door by having some South Korean businessmen open up plants. They'll get cheap labor, but we'll inject them with a little bit of capital, and we'll have some cultural exchange beyond the DMZ, and maybe we can improve relations. Maybe we can actually sign an armistice, and maybe we can even talk about reunification if we do this. This was the Korean left. When Lee Myung-bak won, the first thing he did was put a nail in the coffin under U.S. pressure on the sunshine policy. Just ended it outright. Now, when Park went down in 2017, the first thing Moon does is to softly start reopening some of sunshine policy era productions. And what's interesting about that is normally a Republican administration would freak out, and Donald Trump did the first year, kind of, but Trump is a weird guy in the sense that in some ways, when it comes to geopolitics, he's racist. Do not miscount this, but he's a pragmatist. He really is.
Yeah. I agree with you. And I think I want to do another. I'm going to Shanghai you like I try to do.
You go ahead
with this is a revolution, but the whole Iran thing is fascinating because I'd love to get your input, like in the future. But yeah, like you're right. You're right, and I think shows should be, because you and I can talk about it because we're not pundits to left or right. We're students.
I mean, I'm a far leftist, but I don't care. Like in this, if it comes to foreign policy, I'm amoral.
You're not left as far as
alignment to the Democrats. Yes.
Yeah. So then the thing is that people don't understand that especially like with Korea, like what you were saying about that pragmatism. It was also like Iran. Now, Doug McGregor, the colonel, highly embedded with military industrial complex, highly embedded with the rank, West Pointer, all this. But he has some pragmatic views on Ukraine that, I'll listen to. As a matter of fact, he was just on the gray zone with Max Blumenthal and Aaron Mate. And Aaron Mate was saying, I don't agree with you on these things, but there's something that you're saying that does make sense about the pragmatism. And actually, McGregor did advise Trump on several things indirectly. People don't know about his influence on Trump. But yeah, like I get what you're saying.
So what's interesting about the Trump situation, though, and I remember laughing like, well, Trump is risking nuclear war. I'm like, you know what? Trump may be actually, and he's blowing smoke out his butt. But I will tell you culturally that hyperbole is actually appreciated. It's like and I mean, Korea is it's hard to describe. People think it's a lot like Japan. It's not. Like there's a hyper politeness, and yet there's also like when rhetoric goes crazy in Korea, it goes crazy. Like we're talking about like, you know, a word I'm not going to say because it's so profound that the few Korean listeners I do have would be really offended, but it basically means, and I'll say it in English, like fuck your family back 15 generations. And it like the rhetoric will get absurd. And I was like,
what is it like Shangno Sekia?
No, Shibal.
Okay.
And get people can be mad, and I probably mispronounce it. It's also I think it's 13. It's 13 if it's pronounced slightly differently and they skip it, or 14 or 15. I forgot what it is. My Korean is fading, but I can swear in it.
Good.
But the
pragmatism you're talking about?
Yeah, pragmatism there was interesting though because it was a specific combination. It was a weird blowhard racist, conservative, nationalist, but who really does want a couple of foreign policy victories under his name. And if he can get the armistice done, he'd be like, look, I nixed into China's North Korea. What the fuck are you going to do?
That's true. And that is true. That's what's missed with a lot of critics. They're not saying it.
Well, then they just call him a traitor. And I'm like, no, that's not. I mean, yes, Trump may be on 1,000 levels, but that's actually not one of them. And the other thing I would say though is they also missed that the Korean progressive movement was walking a line on this and actually creating space for this to happen. All right. And while I say they're walking a line, I don't want people to think I'm calling these people leftists and the Marxists. They are not. All right. And they have even cracked down on the left during COVID there. I want to emphasize that. But what I'm saying is that particular thing was only possible because you also had a non-conservative in the Korean seat in South Korea who wanted the sunshine policy and all that to kick off. And if you could get agreements with the Americans to back down, that is more possible. You can start talking about disinvestiture from the military. The one thing I have to say is you were talking about the political economy in North Korea. Let's talk about this for a second. During the 80s, Korea has an okay North Korea has an okay relationship with China, all right? But its primary trading partner and loyalty was actually to Stalin's Russia in specific. They kind of don't know what to do during the Khrushchev period and particularly during the Sino-Soviet split, and so they kind of play both sides. But when the Soviet Union falls, all they really have is heavy industry and collectivized agriculture. And they have no commercial market to dump their heavy industry. So what if you're a producer of heavy industry, you don't really have the ability to modernize your economy. You don't entirely want to, because to get that would also require foreign capital now, and it's going to expose you to either China or the West. You don't really want either one. You're willing to work with China on a limited basis. Well, they try to keep their economy afloat by the military first policy. One, for defense from the Americans, that's real, and it's aggressive. But the other is it's really just a way to keep people employed.
Yes. Yes.
And
and also the morale factor, because these are people that are also, when I say these are people, I'm meaning Jung and Sung, they were afraid of of things imploding all the time. So you're right that they needed. I wouldn't say they needed. They chose that because of the limited options that they had.
Yeah, I would say they chose it, and furthermore, China has to walk in line with them too, because if North Korea fails, not only do they have a U.S. ally on their border, they also have a bunch of highly nationalistic North Koreans going into the Korean prefecture.
Yes,
in China. So this is something that people,
and those guns can be turned over.
Right. So this is something that they don't understand, because this is not just a threat for them to have the Americans on their border. It also could potentially cause it could cause a situation that you don't have. Like the Chinese Koreans are a recognized nationality within Korea. They have some amount of autonomy. They're not in the way, they're not denied autonomy like, say, the Tibetans are, certain Western Chinese ethnic minorities. But they don't. But it's because they're not hostile either at all. Like, they're totally integrated into northeastern Chinese society. And the and the North Koreans still have an okay relationship with Russia even after the fall of the USSR, but Russia doesn't have the money to help them after 1992 during the Chicago Bulls period. It is also losing its heavy industry. So the only thing it can really do is take North Korean labor because it's cheap, but they don't want to do too much of that either, because it could actually upset nationalists within Russia. And these are the only economic outlets that North Korea has, because there's a worldwide embargo, and like, they can occasionally maybe trade with Cuba, who's way the fuck away and near the number one enemy. And like a few other nations will kind of do some backdoor business with them, and they have diplomatic relations with some Europeans, kinda, but they don't have trade relations because of the American embargo. So they're SOL. They're in some ways.
This is why I appreciate this. That's why I'm always talking about, and I'm not using the politically correct word Shanghai, but basically conscripting you to wanting to talk about this deeper, is that, you hear guys like Dan Carlin. He has some interesting things on hardcore history, but he's not, when he talks about North Korea, he doesn't get this deep. And I don't expect them to, but to a certain extent, you've got to talk about it, because that's to a certain extent exposing the psyche of the North Koreans to the general public. And going back to what you were saying about how the North Koreans were SOL, it's not like you see these guys starting revolutions. Yeah, they're doing economic deals with weapons and stuff with Iran and Syria, but they even went out on they failed on a loan, like I said earlier, about this whole survival notion of like loan default. They went loan default on Iran and stuff like that. But it's not like they're not sending troops to Angola like the Cubans. You know what I mean?
Right.
They're not, like, during the Cold War. This is what the ahistorical evaluation of North Korea, which I think is unfair. You and I both know about military studies, that North Korea is mostly talking about revolution and all this stuff, but from a Korean context. But they're not talking about spreading revolution like Che and all these other people, like mass revolution. You know what I mean?
No. The one thing I think we also need to talk about here is the advent of Korean nationalism, because it is kind of unique. It's not unique. Nationalism is not unique to Korea, but the way it manifests in both Koreas is interesting. There is some truth, and I know I have DPRK stands who get mad that I say this, that there are some elements of DPRK Jusei ideology that embrace racial nationalism with a component of solidarity. Okay, they do actually, but they embrace racial nationalism to a way that would strike us as quasi-fascist. That's real, and when I'm saying now, I'm saying this amorally and totally in the context of the early 20th century. All right, so during the Japanese occupation,
but they're not setting up eugenic literature. They're just basically.
I understand. Although I want to talk about this because it does lead to some weird stuff.
Okay.
They and the South at the same time, from the Korean nationalist movement, construct a romantic and racial nationalist movement at the same time to fight the Japanese. It is ironic that the kind of Korean national myth and the idea of Minyuk, that thing I mentioned all the way back now almost 2 years ago, traces back to the Korean anarchist movement, which is an inspiration to both the Korean communist movement and the Korean right nationalist movement, because they see the need for both a romantic but uniquely Korean mythology that picks up on the united cultures that have made up the modern culture of Korea, going back to before to like Gochoseon, which is an actual state, but it basically means ancient Choseon or ancient Korea. But they pick up on this. They pick up on this Japanese blood race ideology that has come from Germany. And they say, look, to fight the Japanese who are doing this primitive, like we're the primitive versions of them, we need to come up with a nationalist understanding of ourselves as a unique race. We are uniquely Koreans. Like, yes, the Japanese may be descended from us in some ways, culturally or maybe even physically, but we are uniquely Koreans. We have our unique bloodline. We go back to these, they started picking up on ancient shamanistic myths about bears. I mean, it's all, it's quite weird. But this is from the progressive left anarchists. This is picked up as part of the National Consolidation Project to give Koreans an identity during the Kim Il-sung period as well. And you also see this in South Korean popular culture, to the point when you see stuff about Choseon and Shilla, you will hear the word Minyuk used as if it was used in Korean 300, 400, 500 years ago. It was not. Right? It is a modern concept in the Korean language. It is at the earliest you see it, I think, is the 19th century, early 20th century. So, but this was done so that the Koreans could resist imperialism and claim to be a coherent nation state, just like, ironically, Lenin did with Ukraine, etc., etc. This was an extension of Soviet, actually, it's a borrowing of Soviet policies that they saw working in Russia, and also the romantic nationalisms of Europe, which had just finished. We got to remember this. We think about these European countries like Italy and Germany, and as old. They're not. Like, they're not even old cultures. Like, the cultures that compose them are old, but the unified German culture,
yes, right,
is like 1854.
Yeah, Garibaldi, 1868 or something.
Right, exactly.
You're right. Yeah.
So this is what the Korean project, the Korean anarchists are trying to do. The Korean anarchists are the basis, just like in China. They join up with the communists and become the basis of the Communist Party. They also, though, in the South, flip sides and start supporting NATO out of a fear of Stalin. They split. All right, but that myth is there. Now, what is interesting is actually, there's a book called the Cleanest Race, which I think is a little bit anti-DPRK propaganda, but I think is a little bit of it's actually documented history, that talks about how they use this to talk about international solidarity, but for true nations. And so one of the things you see that is kind of unique to Korean ethnocide in a way that, like, confuses a lot of Americans is, like, a focus on, like, oh, you can be whatever as long as you are that. If you are half something and something else, that's a big fucking problem. This is actually a side effect of this blood race idea, because they do start thinking about, they do tie it because of the borrowing from the Japanese also imports all these racial concepts that are not exactly in the Soviet, these other race projects. But they are kind of in the romantic nationalisms of Europe, but only they're not as articulate. And you see this in both the North and South. But what's interesting about the North is the North did not want to adopt the old, like, we're an isolated kingdom. They're like, we're isolated, we're unique, we're pure, we're clean, but we can have solidarity with these other peoples. But you do see, for example, one of the things they would throw at the Americans in particular is that the Americans were a hybrid people. And that became part of some of the rhetoric. Now, I say this because this throws us off, because what I'm saying is like this nationalism that we see even in its virulent kind of racialist form, which was already reactionary when it came to Japan and was part of Japan's imperial project, although there were leftists that supported Japan's imperial project as a counter-imperialism to the West, which is a whole nother thing. That's a whole nother discussion. But the reason why this came up was not even to fight the Americans. It was to form a coherent ethnic, racial, and most importantly, national identity against the Japanese, and then to stand apart from being subsumed into the Soviet Union, but working with them as part of the nations who were aligned. But since they were also closer to China and had depended on China during the Korean War, probably more than they did the USSR, even though Kim Il-sung was more sympathetic to Stalin than to Mao, this led to all kinds of pivoting and positing and like incorporating anti-Confucian rhetoric and Confucian rhetoric at the same time.
Right. And one thing that I would say, because we have spent a good amount of knowledge on this, and I know what you're saying. I mean, you have a greater knowledge of this, and maybe it's something that I want to check out more. But let's not confuse it with how it was used, you know, as this is going on. This type of kind of like thinking, you know, pure blood thinking is very different in many ways from the imperialist. I know it, you know, the Japanese have it, but it even, you know, how it's expressed in Europe and even in the United States, how it's worked out with the violence.
I would say
so. It's a different type of nationalism. It's
right.
Like what you're saying. Yes, I'm down with that, and a self-determination, some type of narrative, you know, building that's necessary, but it's not to the extent of, and maybe it's playing out in different ways right now as it, you know, the economy.
I would say in so much that there is any idea of Korean superiority, there is some. I don't know about the North. I really don't. I can't speak to it at all. As far as like, this is what I know from reading history in English, even. So you should also take that into account. In comparing sources and looking at what I know about the political economy, some of which I have read in other languages. What I would say is that what is interesting about this is if it was supremacist, it was not expansionist. This was which is not to defend it, but it is.
No. We're studying it, man. We're studying it, my brother. I'm not pulling a Pascal. I'm joking, Pascal. I just.
No, there's no trick here.
I'm joking. He doesn't do that, but
I do want people to understand
it.
When we're looking at the formations of nationalisms.
Yes.
Whether they're imperial or not. One of the interesting things about German is the German imperialism that led to fascism was initially defensive. I actually want to point that out to you. That's why there's all this focus on Tacitus. That's why all this focus on like these, you know, these sea powers who are cutting us off, and we don't have it. We don't have any colonies or very few colonies. We have to do it ourselves. That was part of the German narrative. That was part of the Japanese narrative until they decided they wanted to have colonies. So like, if the West gets to do it, why don't we?
Right.
And then these national projects, and you have to remember that the peoples, and I am saying people specifically because unified Korea happens in the Chosun dynasty. That's actually like in the 14th century, 15th century. It on a European historiographer scale, we would consider it early modern. But Korean cultures, plural, but the various cultures that led to the modern Korean language, etc., have been around for legitimately for 5,000 years. Like we got archaeological evidence, we got linguistic evidence, and So these are old cultures. There are I say cultures though importantly because I do think the idea of this unified modern Korean culture is a myth. It's a myth that we have all done. It is just as much a myth about British culture or even English culture being unified for more than like since Elizabethan period. You know, it is a myth. But it is also true that these people were subject to both modern and pre-modern imperialism. One of the interesting things about Korean fears of imperialism is, Koreans will tell you, well, the Americans kind of screwed us. So, I mean, even these are South Koreans, where the Americans kind of used us, but our enemies have mostly been other people around here. And we've been used as pawns in geopolitical stuff. And you'll get, I have gotten this from people, from defectors too, and we resent the shit out of that because we've been used as tools in these great ideological wars of which we were kind of invested, but not entirely. Even if we want to do communism, we want to do it our way. We want to,
and that's the problem with, from what I've heard and some of the things that I've read, from the military, as far as understanding North Korea with the Soviet influences, just like what you said, that they wanted to do it their way. They wanted it like Burger King, and here it is, these Soviet Koreans, are trying to administer everything from like the Kremlin, and that's causing like a lot of tension, because you've got the local Koreans also who are hybrid, kind of like communists or sympathizers, and they're not, they're like what you're saying, they're not, they're trying to.
Right, and this was also not a proletarianized economy. This is the other thing that we have to think about from the standpoint of Marxism. Like, when the Korean nationalist revolutions happen, this is a colonial state that is, I have to point this out, that had a pretense, like, yes, the state that replaced the Choson right before the split, before the Japanese occupation, was the Great Han Empire, but that name is sort of a joke, which is why the North Koreans don't call back to it. That's uniquely to the South that calls continuity with that, because they're just like, that was a joke. We lost independence under them. If we didn't lose it to the Japanese, we're going to use it to the Russians. And by the Russians, I don't mean the USSR. I mean specifically the Tsarist Empire. Like, what do we have? We have nothing. Like, the North Koreans, like, we have nothing to be proud about that. But we have this Choson, and South Korea, even though it mentions Han in its name, it's also, its period is Choson too. Like King Sejong's in the middle of the square still. King Sejong is the unifier king who had either invented or had invented, I don't know which is actually, I know what the myth is, but I don't know which is actually more true, Hangul, the Korean unique writing system, which enabled mass literacy in Korea, which was also, was really rare in a lot of Asian countries, because, to be fair, Chinese characters are kind of difficult to learn, particularly when you don't have any phonetic relationship to them, and your sentence structure is not even really. Although that's also why ideograms were used in ideogrammic writing was used in Asia, because a lot of the languages that are combined under the same writing system do not actually have the same syntactic structures. They're not in the same language families even. Like, Korean's not related to Chinese, like, absolutely not. So it's, as somebody tried to learn both, I could tell you, like they're not at all alike. So what I find interesting is, like, North Korea is in an impossible situation. Its nationalism, I find personally to be a mistake. I do. I think it's limited a lot of things. But if I am trying to unify a people to fight a foreign invasion,
right,
I want people to understand there's only so many options that most ethnic groups will have, and they went for the one that most people go for. Like, and that's not just true of the North. That is also true of the South. One thing I would say is both of those countries are really damn nationalistic. Like,
yes.
And there are things that when you experience it as an outsider, and I say this as, you know, white bro, I found some elements of Korean culture that I was exposed to shockingly racist. But when I thought about it in the larger context and to why, I could understand how it got there without it trying to be supremacist. Because I would also say, one of the most interesting, I'll just mention this and I'll let you talk. I've been talking as much as you, as not more.
No. I wanted this out because I could say that and people are like, oh, he's just whatever, I wanted to get, you know, your perspective, and I wanted the audience to kind of like see it because you saw it, how it's come up. I see it from an old man, you know, my dad, who, you know, survived riots, experienced a lot of death in his life, you know, served in, you know, combat situations. And so I'm getting a certain thing, his nationalism, from a different perspective, but I wanted you to explain it for the audience because it is very unique. And I know there are academic papers on it. There's, you know, there's area study, you know, concentrations on what you're talking about, and you condensed it and described it well, much more knowledgeable than what I know about, because again, I was always
hesitant
fighting against that, huh?
I'm always hesitant to be the white American telling people
no,
culture,
but you are, but you're, you know, I'd say even when you talk about the Ukraine, and I mentioned this before, you're the only one, you know, on Varn blog that has, you know, with the other shows, including the think tank shows, they don't have any disclaimers. They'll just talk about different countries, and we've been able to talk about a lot, huh?
I want people to know I'm not a professional Koreanist. I just have Korean family, and I was obsessed.
But he knows a lot, and it's also not, and he's not speaking like his ethnographic interpretations, his hermeneutic of the Korean nationalism can be validated. So he's not just talking about, okay, he was a professor there and he's talking about his lived experience. He's talking about something that's very real, I think very important to look at, because it's something that even someone like Edward Said didn't really talk about as far as part of something being post-colonial, right? He doesn't. Right. A lot of these post-colonial, you don't hear Spivak talking about, you know, Korean nationalism, or how you know, or these other folks. It's often missed, you know. I mean, you always hear about Ho Chi Minh going to the League of Nations, but people don't talk about Koreans going to the League of Nations, and they probably, to a certain extent, had this type of nationalism that they had to kind of like somewhat present to a certain extent, you know.
I think that Korea, like Choson ethnocentrism was probably real. So I don't want to make it sound like this is all totally modern, but I will say that this particular form of nationalism, I believe, was defensive because it didn't come out. It actually didn't come out of the Korean ruling class. That's the one thing I want to point out. It didn't come out of like the last vestiges of the Choson or Han, like Confucian aristocrats. It came out of people trying to figure out how in the fuck they were going to unify to fight the Japanese after the Americans just said, who no one can figure out why the Americans got to say this either. Like, why did the Americans come out from all the way over the ocean and just say, because I mean, even like we weren't even the world hegemon yet. Like this is another thing that like
right.
Like people don't get this. Like we're brought in as a neutral party, and when we say like, okay, Battle of Incheon ends the Russo-Japanese War. Japan gets Korea. Bye. And like that's kind of what happened. Like so it's and this is a culture that has been beset by Japan, by China, and by Russia at different times. And then the Europeans are looming and the Americans are looming, and they know what we did with the gumbos in Japan. And so like they're trying to come up with some kind of national narrative to unify people to fight that, and one that is egalitarian to themselves. All right. As a person interested in anthropology, I think it's totally understandable. As a person who thinks that nationalism in general is something that I do believe may have served progressive purposes at certain times in history. I do, but in general turns on itself, and I think in the Korean case it has. All right. But in general, this is not an expansionist ideology. It is not. It is ethnocentric. It is racial. And it's racial in ways it's even hard to describe to Americans, because I'm like, look, in the diaspora, yes, Koreans think of themselves, Korean Americans, Kyopos, etc., think of themselves as Asians, and Koreans. In Korea, they do not. In Korea, you're the Minyuk or you are not. Like, and in some ways, me as white foreigner and Filipino foreigner and a bunch of different groups will all be Waikugan, right? And what I was about to say is, as a person with some Jewish family members, come from a Jewish background, what I found interesting is the Korean culture has an obsession with Judaism.
Yes.
Which is interesting. Part of it's just to piss off the Japanese. I really do believe. But part of it, because it's even true of the Korean right, is that this idea of an ethnic group that is chosen and is unified, but
that's why everything that you're saying goes. Everything that you're saying goes along with why it was so easy for Protestant Christian missionaries to spread Presbyterian, Submanri.
Presbyterian is huge in Korea.
Yeah,
like Presbyterianism in specific.
That type of what is it? Predestination. In many ways, I think every time you're describing all this, I'm like, this is why, in many ways, you've got Koreans with this understanding of predestination theologically that's so simple to them,
Right. And then you have this Confucian stuff, and some of the stuff is, I would say, is very reactionary. Don't get me wrong, and it's rife in both. I think in both cultures. I'm very hesitant to speak on the DPRK because it is really hard to get a good feel in it. As an American, before 2014, I think you could have gone. You can't enter from the Korean side. You have to enter from the Chinese side or the Russian side. I think the Chinese side. It's inordinately expensive because you have to pay the government for your own handlers. If you take pictures, whatever that aren't approved, you can you can have that stuff confiscated. That's all real, by the way. Like, people aren't making that up. And I thought about it actually just out of curiosity, because I also, I was a leftist.
Let's do it.
Yeah, I was a leftist before I went to South Korea, but even I was like, the North is. I wonder what's actually going on, because I hear so many different things that are wildly discongruous. And I just don't understand. And and you could meet, like, if you were in Laos or Cambodia, you'd meet not just defectors, you meet like just North Koreans living abroad. And you would know because the Korean was different from what you'd heard in Seoul for sure. But it was still like getting people to talk to you uses a language barrier almost always. Like you didn't know if you were getting a defector who had a particular story, or maybe they had a unique experience. The whole situation, and I will say some of those defectors go through some crazy shit to get out. Like it's actually not that common, but the ones who do, they have to go illegal. They're like mules through China because you'll get automatically deported back. And like you end up usually going through Thailand or something. And then a lot of people exploit North Koreans in Southeast Asia. And then maybe sometimes you get to the States or to South Korea, but it's kind of rare. And I'm guessing that that's selected for a certain kind of person, so you don't know what you're getting as like as the experience of anybody. So I'm always hesitant whenever I hear like someone's from North Korea. I'm like, well, I believe that you're from that, but are you telling me what most people think or not? I don't know, and I can't know that. And even with anything I've said about like Korea in general, I want you to also know young people in Korea are pretty international. They all have some English skills. You have to pass the state board exam. So they have access to most of the internet. The only thing they can't access is like certain things that are deemed North Korean propaganda and most porn. So they know a lot about the world. They're super like, and I would say I saw their opinions very much liberalizing and internationalizing, but I also saw, this is 12 years ago, I also saw a backlash even then beginning to form. A lot of anti-foreign sentiment. And then the fact that there's a lot of very old Korean people who have had ambivalence about the way things have gone under either the progressives or the neoliberal right in South Korea. And the voting is wild because of that. It looks a lot like America in that like it's very close and it's hard to predict.
And all of that, I think, to a certain extent, also has to do, like you said, with the older generation wanting to preserve that conservative, traditional way. At the same time, you've got younger people participating, doing the right things, like, for example, serving in the military, but then coming back. And I'm sure you heard this, that nowadays they're thinking, if they haven't abolished it, maybe they have, but like the point system, like in the United States, you have that like within a government job. As far as you serve in the military, I think you get 5 points for employment. If you're disabled vet, you get 10 points for your government application. In the Korean business world, because they have conscription, and at one point you couldn't really get out of the military service.
It's universal conscription unless you go into police, I think. And the police are super disrespected in Korea not because they're police, but because they're seen as cowards who didn't go into the military.
Exactly. And even in My Sassy Girl, the movie, the classic movie, that I don't think, because of the neoliberalism going on and all the anti-feminism going on, I don't think you're going to have something as great as My Sassy Girl anymore, as like the Korean chick flick, right, that comes out, in Korean cinema. And it shows like this dominant Korean girl, upper class girl, kind of spoiled, entitled, who kind of picks on that famous Korean actor, comedian guy. You know, they made fun of him in the introduction because they said, you know, you didn't serve like on the DMZ, you know, you were some clerk somewhere, you know what I mean? So this type of, you know, militarism, shaming, like you just said about the police and all that, it exists. And so you've got younger people that served in the military, did the right thing, and they're coming back. They're not given opportunities. That point system for general employment doesn't count for military service now. I think they either took it off or took it out, or they're taking it out. And they're viewing women as like competition, but in a very unrealistic kind of way, you know. These type of things are really kind of igniting the conservative conservative spirit within the younger generation.
Yeah, I think what we'll see is a really polarized younger Korean generation, and along the lines of the United States in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But in a way that's hard for the people in the US to understand because it's not our culture and it rhymes a lot. I think with a lot of these cultures, on one hand, I want people to know people are a lot more alike everywhere in the world than you think. Like, I'm not one of these people who's like a cultural essentialist who thinks that like people are somehow fundamentally different if they're raised in Russia and China. I don't believe that. Right. But on another hand, I do think sometimes some of these cultures rhyme enough with us that we think we understand them and we don't. And even if you've lived there, even if you speak a little Korean, like, you know, I think to understand Korean culture, you do need to understand the Korean language. But I also think some of what I've told you today or talked about, like, I actually don't find in Korean sources. I actually find it a lot in like translated Japanese sources, Koreanists outside of Korea writing about it. So Korean Americans, Korean Europeans, Chinese scholars writing about Korea. Like in Korea, I would actually I would yearn for this knowledge, and then I would get myths, and then I would have another Korean professor like often be like, hey, since you're actually interested, like, look at this American book, or look at this. One of the big ones is Primitive Selves, which is about the framing of the Japanese occupation. Another one is a lot of the source material looked at to understand Teresa Park Kun-chai's dictate, which I mentioned earlier. I think I call it Park Kun-hee. It's Park Kun-chai. It's Teresa, and then Park like you think it is, and then C-H-A.
Cool.
And she's a Korean American. She died. She was an artist. She wrote a very avant-garde novel, prose poetry, documentary thing. That was kind of debated between postmodernists and diaspora Korean nationalists for a long time. And it's interesting because it's embracing of some of the things I'm talking about, but it also is critiquing them. Like she is both trying to understand and explain Korean nationalism, but she also seems to kind of actually reject parts of it. But I say this because I think Korean culture is going to be more and more important, but also people think that a lot of these things are economically, you know, the way actually Europeans talk about America. So right now, American culture is having more influence on European culture than it's probably ever had. But we're economically less important than we've been in the past. It's the internet. It's the fact that we moved into cultural production as a way to keep our influence up. And we're seeing this, like we saw it with Japan in the 90s and the aughts, and we're seeing it with Korea now, in the aught-teens and now. And I think that should be noticed, because I also think I think it can mislead us into thinking that we understand Korea, that it's a super prosperous economy, and it is. It is a rich nation. I want people like South Korea is a rich nation. It is a very, you know, it is a nation that is incredibly innovative. I would even argue that the North is pretty damn innovative. It's how they survived.
That's what I was trying to say before, and I'm not trying to glorify.
No, I mean, I think parts of
poverty in a way, but how people look at poverty as far as a lot of the different things, like you're saying, as far as like their way of life, their daily life, their I don't know, and I would say it's maybe just so much off the grid that there's just stuff. So what if they don't have an iPhone? And I'm not saying that doesn't excuse.
No, I mean, but everyone does have an apartment
like
there.
That. You know what I mean? Huh?
But there isn't. I will say this: I have seen no evidence of massive homelessness in North Korea. So
right.
I would say that, like, if I was going to defend an actually existing socialist state, I'd be like Cuba after 1995. Like, but I want people to understand that I think a lot of the worst elements of even North Korean culture is, one, slightly overstated, and two, it's defensive. And a lot of the isolation that we have imposed, and I say we, and we being Americans here, have imposed on them, have made sure that a lot of the worst traits of nationalism were going to emerge.
Yes, and I'm glad that you did spend a lot of time on nationalism, because I'm saying, why is he going in that area? And that was my subconscious trying to avoid it, but you handled it really well in a very real way, as it's connected to how it can help a lot of Americans and a lot of Westerners paying attention to the show to understand, not to condone North Korea, but to maybe understand why North Korea is operating in this way, why the election was so close, recent election was so close to a certain extent.
In South Korea,
and why South Korea has these policies where, what's her name? And I love her scholarship. I think Melissa Shaw.
Mm-hmm.
I think she, I like her scholarship, but she just says, why can't Koreans just give up? Again, I'm glad on this show you explained it, and I filled in some of the gaps, but she's trying to say, oh, why can't Koreans just forgive the Japanese and just, this is like minor, She didn't say it's minor, but she was like, they could just forgive the Japanese. I mean, they did give them loans and stuff. And it's like, there's a little bit deeper than that.
There's a lot deeper. I mean, like, basically the formation of the modern nation is dependent on the trauma imposed by the Japanese, and that is true for both the North and the South. And I mean, we talked about off air. We talked about Hanpyeong, which was, I guess, is like the vague feeling of depression that you might feel as a Korean. It's
a clinical disorder. Yeah, it's internalized anger, because under occupation you couldn't do it. Under a KCIA regime. By the way, my cousin was married to the son of the director of the KCIA, Wook. So when you're living under that, you're going to have a lot of issues, unresolved issues. And it's going to take generations to get through. There's going to be people like my dad who are going to die with this kind of stuff with them. And so I think you're giving a narrative of nationalism that explains their efforts to find a certain type of self-determination and as Freud would talk about this whole thing on aggression. And I'm dealing a lot with the U.S. military, and now you're finding a lot of U.S. military people, including from elite forces, kind of like agreeing, there weren't things that were done well, in Iraq and Afghanistan, and now they're being more open about it. And when people ask, well, what would make them do these kind of things, and it's something that goes back to Freud, which you get, and R.C. Roberts gets, and that is any type of gross extreme violence. In many ways, it's because of, and these harsh binary thinking. It's because of the anger that you have towards yourself. The things within yourself that are highly violent and have that fire that in many ways, it's either pain or some type of trauma, abuse, and it comes out, in different ways, in these soldiers that I'm talking about. Yeah. And then in those South Korean rock, Tiger Brigade, Tiger Division, Blue Dragon Marines in Vietnam, it came out that way. And with Park Chung-hee, and Sung Min-rhee. So these are things that are important to look at, that I think a lot of Americans, it's easy to kind of look at Fox News and CNN and just automatically kind of say, well, they're a bit extreme or whatever. They've got, too much going on as far as pride, and all that. And
I would say that Americans right now aren't even good at doing this with themselves. Like, they're not even good at trying to put themselves in the mindset of I'm not one of these people who says, we need to convert the conservatives, because you're not, by the way. No. I am a person who believes that mass politics emerges when the kind of homeostasis of like 70 to 80% of the population not really giving a shit start to care, because there's a material reason for them to care. And all of a sudden, these other ideologies who are basically maintained by weirdos like us become attractive, and we're like 10 to 20% of the population when times are good. And I also, I believe this, and really, even mass politics, it's like only when one side gets above 33% of the population, and then the other side is smaller, and most of the people at least want to oppose you. Like, that's what mass politics is, even. And I think we can't put ourselves in the mindset, not of the ideologue, which I guess everybody's always trying, but in the person who, for class reasons, are for national defense reasons, are for fear, are from poverty, are from generational trauma, or whatever. All right. Like, there's 1,000 overdetermined reasons for this. Comes to a conclusion to side with the weirdo that you don't understand. And I think American myopia and siloness is so bad that we can't do it with other class groups, like even the PMC discourse. I want to talk about, like, this is a distraction, but I'm glad you did. It's PMC versus PMC violence. Like, this is still a myopic worldview, because when you hear some of these people talk about the working class, I'm like, you don't know them either. Like, your idea of the working class is like 1950s, like industrial workers, which are like 8% of the population at best, and like declining, and they're also not the people you think they are even then. So I bring that up because I think this is a failure of a politics internally, and then when you start throwing that towards the world, you have all this projection of good and evil, Marvel superhero shit. Like I, on one hand, think the DPRK is a fucked up regime. I want people to, like, I'll say that unequivocally.
Yeah, but we're saying that.
Yeah, but I will also say we need to understand, like, the material conditions and the psychological pressures that would make this not insane. It is not because, like, North Koreans have been brainwashed. It is not because they're somehow uniquely ethnically fucked up. It is a bunch of things happening in historical succession, a lot of which, if you look at them at any given moment, I think we can totally empathize with. And I think when we approach understanding North Korea or South Korea or anywhere whose language we don't generally know, and whose culture seems pretty alien, and they come from a different religious tradition, and we don't have the history, they're not part of our larger narrative. I mean, like, one of the things, I mean, even in racial narratives, right? Like, the idea of Asian, you know what the word for Asian is in Korean? as far as I know, it's Asia, which means it's not a Korean concept.
Right.
Like, and the idea of Asianness is sometimes even treated as a colonial export. And although that's not consistent, I think that's kind of an extreme position. But I would say,
yeah, they're not. No, I get what you're saying, and if anything, some of that also has to do with their limits, culture, not limits as far as beings, but the word gangpe, as has this dirty gangster, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's much more, like their nationalism and Confucianism combined and all of this ethnic kind of like, not superiority, but like
I should say ethnocentric, maybe.
Yeah, ethnocentric is in many ways tied to a lot of class issues that I think has, and I'd like to do a part two, maybe shorter or longer, but on the class issues in Korea that have limited real self-determination, because that's also a good critique of class. Gives a better understanding also to the Korean peninsula situation that I think a lot of people don't have an understanding of. I'm still trying to construct it, but I think I think you've got something here where
I've been thinking a lot about this because my experience of world capitalism is like the basic capitalist classes where I've ever been in the world have kind of been the same. Like there are capitalists, there's the state managerials, and then there's various kinds of people excluded from that: proletarians, serfs, lumpen. Serfs are rare, but peasants. But what I would say though is the experience of all these intermediate class expressions, they are so different in some of these cultures that you don't always recognize them immediately when you're experiencing them as the same kind of relation that you have. So I think Marx is often, we talk about all that a salad melts in the air, and I've said all that a salad melts, like, but it ain't all gone. Right. Like, I do think we have to admit that, like, these religious cultures, they shape the way capitalism is experienced in some of these different places in the world, because not just because they're part of the superstructure or whatever, but because they actually even affect the way you structure the relations of production, which are not part of the superstructure in the Marxist metaphor. They're part of the base. And so, like, the chaebol system is still bourgeois. It's still corporate bourgeois, but it is differently structured than our corporate system. And if you don't understand that, you're not going to understand some of the particularities of the way, even the way, like, if you're working in Korea, your cultural expectations may piss off your coworkers and vice versa. And one of the most funny things I used to always talk about is, like, Korean workers think American workers are lazy, and American workers think Korean workers are lazy. And let me tell you why. I used to teach a class on intercultural communication. The Americans interpret, as a rule, and again, generalizations are never universally true. So these are just kind of like statistical aggregates, people. I'm not saying anybody is like this, but Americans in general see Koreans not hustling on the job, and we go, they're not efficient, thus they're lazy. And they see us not wanting to stay and put in the extra hours for what was used to be a 65-hour work week, and we're like used to 40, and so we always seem to be sneaking off, and we don't want to party with them afterwards, and so we seem like that, and they think we're lazy because we're not putting in the time and we're not putting in the social capital. And I'm like, it's funny because I used to talk to Korean students this, and I'm like, it's funny how we think each other is lazy, right? But, like, what are your cultural assumptions about what laziness looks like? And here, let me tell you what my cultural assumptions about what laziness looks like. And what do you know? We're going to trigger each other, right? Now, at no way have we actually changed any of the fundamental MCM capitalist relations here. Like, the basic structure of capitalism is still the same in Korea as it is in America, as it is in Egypt, as it is in Mexico, and I'm just saying this places I've lived, as it is in Germany. But this experience of the structure and these relations of production and these superstructural things too, religion, religious value things, narratives, ideological narratives, pop cultural stuff, like that is so different that it obscures that.
Yeah.
And it also makes it very hard for us to have real international solidarity, particularly with peoples who we fundamentally are removed from and who are removed from us. And I think that you should always approach as a good internationalist, like thinking like at the core, people are the same kind of monkey. We just are the same kind of fucking monkey. Like, there's not that much difference. We have like 6 female ancestors. We don't actually have that much genetic diversity for primates. Like, there's not that much difference between us. I'm sorry, cultural relativists. That's just true. On the same notion, but we explain these things to ourselves in such radically different ways, and we express them in such radically different ways that we can either totally try to erase those differences as if they're not real, or we don't try to see that what's prompting those differences are kind of base things that are similar, right?
Yes.
And a lot of what I'm aiming at in these kind of discussions about, like, no, a lot of us aren't even in a situation where we're going to need, frankly, to like really understand the North Korean mind, even if there is something that can be called the North Korean mind, what the fuck ever. Like, there's an American mind. And I would say, yeah, no, there isn't an American mind, but also I can tell you there are certain statistical aggregate things I can say about Americans that are kind of true. Like, I think this is the way we have to approach the world. And unfortunately, this is not easy to do unless you've been put in a truly otherizing situation. And that in our world is reserved to the very lucky, me, or the very rich. Most people who do international travel, it becomes like a sign of privilege. And that's deeply unfortunate for particularly a semi-hegemon. I say semi because we used to be a hegemon. I think we're kind of now, we're still a hegemon and probably the most powerful of the hegemons. But I do kind of think we're in a world where there's not going to be one superpower, and nor should we want it. But we do have to put ourselves in this mindset when we're doing, particularly when we talk about geopolitics. Because, like, for example, on this Ukraine-Russia thing, just because, you know, we're in this right now,
Yeah.
I am not super sympathetic to the Russian political line, but I want to understand it, to look at why it came to be, to understand that it's a contradictory, complicated thing, and it's not a simple matter of a villain. And frankly,
and putting a like on social media, and also leading you, and it happened to me when it first happened, that joining a team that's going over there, who, you know, like, we don't have, it's not like going into Iraq with certain types of intel and certain, you know, command.
People try to recruit you to go fight in Ukraine.
Yeah, and you know, I wrote down like on like Facebook, I was like, hey, you know, come join me. I think I took it down. I mean, because like I knew I was triggered, much like what we're talking about here. I immediately wanted to, you know, look at the villain, because my dad's country was attacked. My dad's country was occupied. So it was really easy for me to say, okay, this is what's happening this is what happened to Korea. This is what's going to happen. You know, this is what's happening to the Ukraine, you know, Russia bad. And then I had to go back and kind of rein it in a little bit and say, you know, these guys that are telling me to go, they themselves are going through their own readjustment issues from Iraq. Almost like, I don't know if you remember the 80s movie, Uncommon Valor. Do you remember? Tex Cobb was in it, I think. You know, it's like, it was based on Ross Perot, loosely based on Ross Perot funding some ex-Vietnam vets to go rescue some POW MIAs in Vietnam. But uncommon valor, let's make it right again. Remember in Rambo, sir, do we have a chance to win again? That's, a lot of us, who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I would include civilians as well. We have not accepted the losses in this global war on terror, and to a certain extent, anything that's going to be like this noble cause to kind of rectify that, it's going to attract, a lot of vets to go over there. I'm not saying a lot, but I'm saying a contingency of vets immediately go over there and get involved into something that they're just not really, on a tactical level, they know what's up, but it's more than tactics involved to be a part of that. The media, as you know, maybe you could say some of this, because this also is tied to North Korea. People think that North Korea, like whatever, we start like some type of insurgency or something like that in North Korea, that the government's just going to fold. I think a lot of people think that the Russians are just like having such a difficult time. I'm saying no, man. They're methodically doing this because they can play the long game.
I would say, like from a tactician standpoint, and I'm not a military tactician, I would say the Russians have done not as well as they should have, but they are not losing either, and that is something that's hard for people to. But I would also tell people
their crack troops aren't even there. Their crack troops, they have 100,000 the real troops. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's also a Russian tactic, by the way, to hold off I would also say, though, the Ukrainians are fighting way harder than anyone expects, but they're probably way more disorganized. They're being invaded. Sure. People who understand fourth generation warfare also knows that actually an insurgency will win over time if it's an occupation, which is why I don't think that's what's likely to happen. But I don't know. Okay, I also don't put it out of the realm that this really is there are inconsistencies on every narrative I've heard about why Russia's doing it, why NATO is doing it, who did what to whom. I've gone back and looked. I've been wrong. I've looked deeper. Me too. I've actually looked at in some ways I blame the Angela Merkel more than I even blame NATO for the situation that happened in 2014. That's something that I wouldn't even have thought I would have come to a week ago. I just started, somebody pointed me to some articles actually in the British press from 2014 and the Wayback Machine. Then I started just looking at stuff and I was like,
I got to do that. I heard about that, but I'm going to check.
I was like, oh, so Euromaidan isn't just a CIA coup by Nazis, but it's also not just Yanukovych fucking up. It's also there's also intertensions within NATO at the time that people are forgetting that literally this is the same time period that Obama got caught having spies on Merkel. And I'm like, this is a complicated geopolitical situation with even allies fucking each other. And any narrative I've heard has been way too simple. And I am now not willing to offer a simple narrative for what happened. What I can tell you is that I believe that we do need to take the Russian and particularly Putin's fear of NATO seriously. Yes. I also think we need to take some of what he says that we would consider reactionary seriously, because I've seen a lot of people also just parrot stuff that just flips the hero villain from the dominant narrative. And I don't want people doing that either. You really have to approach this from the standpoint of, can I put myself in the mindset of both sides? Can I try to understand the contradictory class forces, ethnic forces, religious histories, whatever? Notice I'm not just saying people are as you're a class reduction. No, I actually think you have to look at all this. I think class is usually most important, but I think all of it matters. And so can you put yourself in those mindsets about what's going on within the internal tension of the country? And the thing is, even if you can do all that, you don't know. Like, and I kind of want this with this North Korea talk too. I don't know that this is going through the head of, you will see me cast doubt on what I'm saying. This is what I can deduce from the information that I have from the people that I've talked to. But in the entire time, if some people are talking to me and they're from North Korea in specific, they are either defectors, they speak English, or they at least can speak slow enough, simple enough Korean that Wakugan ass Derek can understand it. So like, it tells you that I can't know what the average North Korean could possibly be thinking. I'm not there. I've never been there. All I know is the conditions that they existed in, and I can posit an empathetic story from those scraps that could begin to understand how someone could have gotten that situation. I try to do that with the Ukrainian side too. You will not also hear me just say that the Ukraine is a bunch of Nazis. I don't believe that. All right. Like there are huge Nazi battalions in the Ukraine. There are huge fascist groups in Russia too.
Yeah.
Some of which are in the Russian army fucking up things in Libya right now. So all this stuff you cannot be a responsible world commentator and view the world as heroes and fucking villains. You can't. And I mean, even I would even say this. I'm going to pick up a Bakutinist line, actually, Bakutin the anarchist. I would even say this with the bourgeoisie.
Okay.
Any individual bourgeois person might actually be a decent human being. You are not looking at the individual bourgeois psychology and extrapolating to all people. As leftists, we should know not to do that. What we should understand is the incentives for the bourgeois as a whole to do certain things are predictable, emergent, and dialectical. We can predict them in mass, but we don't know that just because someone has a bourgeois background that they're actually even going to be our enemy. We don't know. Like,
well, and that's why I think the big problem with a lot of, especially these people talking about kind of like Jordan Peterson or these what is it, Ayn Rand types. They won't look at they won't take on an abductive kind of like best as a psychoanalyst, as 20 to 30,000 hours of combat trauma. My thing, I'm dealing with people that, they leave my office and there is a chance that they're gonna off themselves. So they're going to,
or they're gonna hurt someone else.
Or
let's be honest,
or their daughter, or their wife,
people with
or
PTSD
stranger
are dangerous. Like
exactly. That's not to stigmatize, but when you're in evaluating someone and things are being kicked up in that kind of way, that
I'm gonna do the standpoint thing here and say I have PTSD, so I can say that. But you use, and I think I use, and I think what clinicians are using, and I think this could be something that a lot of people can use as far as looking at the news or creating content, is to have more of an abductive kind of like way of thinking as far as like, what's the possible, but an informed, this is the best possible reason why someone's doing this, that what Putin's doing, or this is the best possible reason that so-and-so is doing, what do you call it, the Ukrainians. And when we're kind of the stuff that you're calling us to do, I see it that way. And I just see it as more informed. It also brings me back to like my theological background, because I feel as though you do take a critical historical kind of approach that evaluates sources, that looks at, before you go into literary narratives. I think that, I can talk to you and you have some kind of frame prior to just talking. And I know you're a poet. I know you're into literature. I know, you have an MFA, but you're not like a lot of common literary theory types, people that I love.
but that they start with the narrative instead
Right.
of going into sources, into going into redactions, study of redactions. I think that's what makes you, Jason Miles, Cuba, and Pascal, the play of redactions, I think in many ways is so weak in like big media, and even in some of, some of the shows that are circulating. But I've been really impressed by your work and the work of some of the other people, because when it comes to like redaction analysis, I can kind of like see, well, this is where you piece this together. This is where you piece that together. And you kind of are open about that, transparent about it, where I think a lot of people, they're just getting a hodgepodge full of stuff. They themselves don't even know
and they're projecting onto the gaps.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And when I say redaction, I'm not trying to use some type of, whatever hoity-toity term. I'm just saying the different pieces, like how are you putting the different parts of the narrative together to form your argument? And I just find it very transparent, and that's why I really want to come on here and talk about Korea in this way, because I think that and I do, I go down a lot on Dan Carlin and whatever hardcore history and stuff like that. He does have some interesting points, like how he described, I heard his, before coming on here, I was hearing his perspective on North Korea, and he does mention certain things regarding, well, we have to put ourselves into Un's position and his fear factor. But unlike what he does on hardcore history, is that you really don't know like how he's setting up arguments as far as the sources and the redactions in his arguments. They're just kind of like a bunch of like hodgepodge historical facts that are just like coming out, and it impresses, certain people in the podcast world. And I don't want to be judgmental. It's an observation, just because the stakes are real. The stakes are high right now. And just think it's important to have this type of information out there.
If you're a confident speaker, if you're a competent speaker with the ability to craft a narrative on the fly, you can often make yourself an authority on anything now, because you can grab clips and come up with a coherent narrative. What I realized that by accident. I started seeing people take what I was saying in certain ways. I realized that people thought I was, trying to form parasocial bonds with them. And yes, when you're real, and actually, I'm going to warn people to have an educational relationship, even with someone you never physically meet, you have a parasocial bond with them. You do. That's how learning works. But what I'm trying to model in my interviews and in the way I, like when we're doing right now, when I'm having just an open dialogue, I tell people all the time, I will talk to any random conservative. I might not have them on my show. I might, if they're not a media person, actually. Or if I know they share enough of a worldview on one thing that we can agree on that one thing sincerely, not as a trap. Otherwise, I'll just talk to them. But people are often shocked when I talk about like friends I have, and yet they're also shocked who I won't platform, right? Because I'm like, well, but that person's a media personality. Like, I either have to gotcha them, which I actually kind of find immoral, or I have to go into debate mode, which I think a lot of times people overestimate the importance of debate mode. I honestly think a lot of people who are debating would not debate you if they thought you would actually hurt their point. And also, as a person who coaches formal debate, sometimes I judge it all the time. You don't learn shit from formal debate, guys. Like that's all rhetoric, and logistics tricks and logic tricks, but I do think this idea of modeling, trying to understand how outside forces could lead a person into a position, try to put yourself in that position temporarily, but not just to empathize with them. That's not just the point. It's also to try to backtrack from that mental model, what led to their position, and then also the real turn, and what most people cannot do is do it to yourself.
Yes.
Why do you feel the way you do?
I'll be honest. When you mentioned and I know you felt it, I'm glad you were, gracious about it. When you started to talk about the nationalism part, until you mentioned that, well, gosh, I get it confused with Mingyung theology, but
Mingyuk, yeah.
Yeah, but what you said, it's dead on. So I want to say that with the audience. It hurt because I know it's true. And when I asked you to kind of elaborate more, you did, as far as, explaining the reasons why and the context and the history and all that stuff, the sociology, the cultural studies aspect, the issues of power tied to it. But then I had to say, the homework for me is to come away with this and say, I caught what he said, and this is true. I'm not, being a jock writer. I use that, it's a boxing term as far as like, oh, Ali was the greatest, Sugar Ray Leonard's the greatest. I'm not jock writing you, but I want to take something constructive from this and challenge this sense of nationalism that I've seen play out in different ways and contextualize it, not just to do a challenging hermeneutic to go back to when it happened. I want to look up the like you said, the anarchist movement that influenced them. I want to understand it, how it plays out today too, to make that leap as well. And then I want to go back and see how it's popped up in different places in the culture and in the history. And that's my homework coming away with this, because I did find it informative. And maybe on both sides, whether it's North Korea or South Korea, it helps myself and the audience know a little bit more than Un is a crazy man who's just ready to set off nuclear weapons and all this. And then we've got
Un is educated at a Swedish IB. Un is educated at a Swedish IB school, guys.
That's right.
He's not even like totally a product of like the North Korean mentality. This is something so accept that too. Like, this is not someone like, I realized this when I was teaching at an IB school in Egypt, and I'm like, I could have taught this guy.
Can you say that
international baccalaureate, which is in generally English language, although not always. International school, they're expensive, they're elite.
Yes, elite.
He was sent away and taught, I believe, in Sweden at an international baccalaureate school. He is Western educated. But also I want to mention something. You were talking about sources. The linchpin for understanding Korean nationalist historiography and the mythos, but also its relationship to Korean anarchism is an important figure in both. And he's considered he's kind of a hero to both the North and the South to this day, and that is Shin Che-ho. And he's the person who wrote the kind of nationalist mythology, actually, but also incorporated Mingyuk, and he did it to fight. He actually did it to like form an anarchist identity.
Wow.
But he did it to fight, particularly the Japanese occupation. And he's the linchpin for me. Once I got that figure, so many things that never made sense to me when I'd hear people talk about it as a kid, what I was told as a kid about North. I just like, how could anyone believe that? Like, and then all of a sudden, like, I get it. I get why it's under stress, it's under duress. I worry, and I'm going to almost sound like a liberal right now. Okay. I worry that people are so afraid of empathizing or contextualizing or drawing mental models of people because they think that means they won't fight them politically, or even if they have to, another way. And I say, no, actually, no. If you want to be a good strategist, you want to understand what people do, you want to win, even, like, you have to do this, and then you have to be able to do what you need to do anyway. And that's going to take a toll on you. This is a reason why I think we have to be careful with certain kinds of things. But I do think, like, the idea, for example, that even someone as reprobate as Winston Spencer, that we just, he's just a racist. Well, yes, he is just a racist, but also, you don't have to empathize with him. You don't have to condone him. You don't have to like him. You can still think he's a monster. But if you want to understand how this ever had appeal, other than bad people are bad, which is a useless circular way of thinking, you need to be able to put your mindset in this way too. So I'm not just telling people this so that they can go off and be kumbaya with the world. That's not what I'm doing. I want you to be able to draw mental models of people, because if you can't really beat them.
Well, I want, and I can talk to you all night about this, but I want in the future also, if possible, if we can engage a certain show on fascism from like the Julius Evola way, because that perspective that you're talking about now, I think is most important, because we're going to be able to understand a Jordan Peterson, a Richard Spencer in many ways, from,
or even a lot of these more normal national conservatives who are going to move away from racialism and start moving towards inclusive ethno-chauvinism, integralism, corporatism, those kinds of ideologies, because they realize that they can't rely on just white people. They know that. And like Brazilian fascism is not a racialist form of fascism. It just isn't. Neither was most of Italian fascism, actually, until, so it's something that I think we're going to really, because everyone's model is actually Richard Spencer, it's Hitler, it's Strasser, even. That's not going to always help you. In fact, though, there's some fascists that can speak real good left talk, that know your mental model and know how to appeal to you as a leftist, and you will not even realize that your politics have changed.
Yes.
If you cannot understand this. And Evola is actually an interesting person for this, because Evola's criticism of the Nazis and the fascists was that they were too modern and too biologist, and that their racialism was not cultural. And like anybody, like any Jew could become a good Italian if they overcame their spiritual Jewishness through struggle. Like, which sounds absurd, but that's the notion of what's going on there. And I'm sorry, people can trick you with this. And I think I do want to point out that one of the reasons why this is appealing, and this is why I mentioned Germany with Tacitus, or even North Korea, is like there is a germ of legit left-wing thought that goes into progressive nationalism that overlaps with that form of thinking, and you can get caught up on it and not even know. And that this is like a bit of thought defense, not so you can de-radicalize people, because frankly, most of the time, you know what de-radicalizes or radicalizes people? Trauma. Like, really, like, honestly.
That's it. And let's
kind of tie up here. We've been going for 3.5 hours.
Like I said, I could talk to you, because I think a lot of times you're more Korean than I am. But let's regroup with some of this, because from the psychological end, Robert J. Lifton has. I want to look at his idea of political trauma, and kind of like some of these ideas that you're talking about from these hyper reactionaries from the past, because it's just like a good dance, because he comes from the left, and then these folks are from, another spectrum, and we can both have like an interesting dialogue about it. But I really appreciate you. And I always check out your shows. So thank you so much.
I've been looking forward to talking to you about this stuff because I knew it was at least going to be interesting. I was like, we're going to talk about Korea. Who knows, like how this is going to go?
For me, it was very empowering because I didn't have like another forum that was really interested in getting this deep. They just kind of wanted to look at, North Korean artillery towards Seoul, and you and I both were able to kind of like go way beyond it. So thank you for that.
That's always going to be a case. I mean, like I hate to say it, but like performative but not really dangerous violence is actually a way to release tension.
Yeah.
Like in some ways, I don't mean this demeaningly. I really don't. But sometimes I think about the North-South Korea bellicosity as like the two dogs that are barking at each other at the fence. And when you open the gate, like they kind of they will fight, but they kind of don't really want to. Like, and I'm not, this is, take all that what you will. I think this is true for Americans too. We are super big barky people and not really big bitey people a lot of the time. But
I definitely want to keep up with you on a lot of this stuff, and I really appreciate it. And I'm getting the sign, and I'm not at all stopping this.
It's totally fine. I think it's going to be hard to listen to this, honestly, because
but
hours long.
Thank you. I know we can continue, but thank you so much. All right.
Thanks
thank you, Varn. Thank you as always.
All right. Have a good night.
Yeah, I that computer, like I told you, my computer crashed. So right now,
right. I know.
Trying to negotiate that. So thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night.